Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Margaret Douglas, a Tudor princess whose nearness to the English throne made her both powerful and perilous during one of history's most turbulent centuries. We'll softly explore her dramatic childhood escapes in the Scottish borderlands, her forbidden love affair that led to imprisonment in the Tower of London, her patient scheming to place her son beside Mary Queen of Scots, and her legacy as grandmother to the king who would unite England and Scotland forever, all while the Tudor dynasty transformed Britain from medieval kingdom to Renaissance power. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which part of Margaret's story interests you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the Tudor age lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Margaret, later known as Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, entered this world on a stormy October evening in the year 1515, not in a grand palace with tapestries warming the walls and musicians playing gentle melodies, nor in a comfortable manor house with fires crackling in every hearth and servants rushing to provide every comfort, but instead in a cold border fortress where autumn rain dripped steadily through gaps in the ancient stone roof and biting wind whistled through cracks in walls that had stood for centuries against Scottish raiders and English armies alike. Tantallon Castle, perched in the wild hills of Northumberland near the Scottish border, was a military stronghold rather than a comfortable residence. Its thick stone walls, built to withstand siege and assault, kept out enemies, but also trapped the cold and damp within. The chambers were sparsely furnished, with rushes on the stone floors, and small windows that let in little light even on bright days. On this particular October night, with storm clouds rolling across the moorland and rain lashing against the fortress walls, at the castle must have seemed like a cold and forbidding place to bring a child into the world. Her mother, Margaret Tudor, the widowed Queen of Scotland and elder sister to England's formidable King Henry VIII, had fled across the Scottish border in desperation just days earlier. At 35 years old, Margaret Tudor was heavily pregnant and travelling in the worst possible circumstances. She had left behind her young son, the infant King James V of Scotland, in the hands of regents and rival nobles who were engaged in a deadly struggle for control of the Scottish throne. She had fled from a husband, Archibald Douglas, who had proven to be more interested in power than in his wife's welfare, and she was making her way toward England and the protection of her brother Henry, though she could not have known whether he would welcome her or turn her away. The journey from Edinburgh to the English border was difficult and dangerous, even in the best of circumstances. The Scottish lowlands were torn by factional violence, with the great noble families, the Stuarts, the Douglases, and the Hamiltons, fighting for supremacy, while the infant king remained a helpless pawn in their struggles. For a pregnant woman travelling with a small escort, attempting to pass through territory controlled by hostile forces, the journey was fraught with peril. Margaret Tudor had to avoid main roads where she might be intercepted, travelling instead through rough country, sleeping wherever shelter could be found, eating simple meals hastily prepared, and always pressing forward toward the safety of England. When labour pains began, and still some distance from any comfortable lodging, Margaret Tudor's party had little choice but to seek the nearest fortress. Tantallon Castle, held by Thomas, Lord Dacre, the warden of the English Middle March, provided the refuge they desperately needed. Lord Dacre, whose duty was to defend the border and maintain order in this wild frontier region, welcomed the Scottish Queen and did his best to provide for her comfort, though the castle's austere accommodations could offer little luxury. The baby girl born that evening, wrapped hastily against the cold in whatever warm fabrics could be found, carried in her tiny body the blood of both English and Scottish royal houses, a heritage that would shape every moment of her long and tumultuous life, bringing her both privilege and danger in nearly equal measure. The circumstances of Margaret's birth on October 8, 1515, tell us everything we need to understand about the world she entered and the forces that would shape her destiny. This was an age of dynastic politics, where royal blood determined one's position in life, where marriages were arranged for political advantage, and where proximity to the throne could mean either great power or sudden death. The baby Margaret was born into the most complicated royal situation imaginable. Through her mother, she was granddaughter to King Henry VII of England, the first Tudor monarch who had ended the Wars of the Roses and established his family's claim to England's throne. Through her father, she was descended from ancient Scottish nobility, connected to families that had shaped Scotland's history for generations. But, more immediately relevant, this baby girl was niece to King Henry VIII, who was at that moment one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. She was half-sister to King James V of Scotland, though that connection would prove more complicated than helpful as the years passed, and she was born at a moment when the relationship between England and Scotland was at one of its lowest points, with the memory of the Battle of Flodden Field still fresh and bitter in Scottish minds. Just 2 years earlier, in 1513, Margaret's stepfather King James IV had led a Scottish army into England, while King Henry VIII was away campaigning in France. The Scottish invasion ended in catastrophe at Flodden Field, where James IV died along with much of Scotland's nobility in one of the bloodiest battles ever fought between the two kingdoms. The baby Margaret was baptized the very next day, October 9th, in the castle's chapel. A simple ceremony given the circumstances, but one that established her identity and her place in the Christian community. Baptism in the 16th century was considered essential for salvation, and no matter how difficult the circumstances, parents ensured their children received this sacrament as quickly as possible. But Margaret Tudor herself was too ill to attend her daughter's baptism. The difficult birth, combined with the stress and hardship of her flight from Scotland, had left her gravely weakened. For weeks, she remained confined to her chamber at Harbottle Castle, tended by the few servants who had accompanied her and by such physicians as could be summoned to this remote fortress. The winter of 1515 to 1516 was a cold one in northern England. Snow fell heavily across the moorlands, making travel nearly impossible. Even if Margaret Tudor had been well enough to continue her journey, the weather would have prevented it, and so mother and baby remained at Harbottle Castle through those long winter months, waiting for spring and better health. We can imagine what those months must have been like. The cold stone walls, the limited comforts that even the best efforts of Lord Dacre could provide, the sound of wind and weather battering the fortress, the worry about what was happening in Scotland, the uncertainty about what reception awaited them in England. But gradually, as winter turned to spring and the first flowers appeared on the moorlands, Margaret Tudor regained her strength. But the baby Margaret, despite her difficult entry into the world, proved to be healthy and vigorous. She had inherited the red gold hair that marked her as a Tudor, the same shade that her uncle King Henry VIII displayed so proudly, and that her cousin Princess Mary would later pass to her own daughter. By spring 1516, mother and daughter were finally able to continue their journey south toward London and the court of King Henry VIII. The king's reception of his sister and her new baby was complicated by political considerations, as almost everything in Henry VIII's life was at that time. On one hand, Henry was genuinely fond of his elder sister Margaret. They had grown up together at their father's court, Henry VII having been unusually devoted to his children and having kept his family close around him. And Margaret and Henry had shared lessons, prayers, and the ordinary experiences of royal childhood. Despite the years since Margaret had left England to marry the King of Scotland, Henry retained warm feelings for his sister and was distressed by reports of her troubles. On the other hand, Henry had to consider the political implications of sheltering his sister and her new child. The baby Margaret represented yet another potential claimant to both the English and Scottish thrones, at a time when questions of succession and legitimacy were becoming increasingly fraught. Henry himself had only one surviving child at this point, his daughter Mary, born in 1516, and the question of whether a woman could inherit and rule England in her own right was deeply controversial. The existence of Margaret Douglas, carrying royal blood from both England and Scotland, added another layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. Nevertheless, Henry welcomed his sister and provided her with apartments at court and with financial support. He showed interest in his new niece, giving gifts and generally behaving as an affectionate uncle. Young Margaret would later remember her Uncle Henry as a large, impressive figure who could be both terrifying and kind, who showered her with presents at Christmas and New Year's celebrations, who called her his dear niece Megget in a tone of genuine affection, but who could also turn cold and dangerous when he felt threatened or disobeyed. This dual nature, affectionate uncle and potential threat, would characterize their relationship throughout Margaret's life. For the first 2 years of her existence, from 1516 to 1517, Margaret lived primarily in England while her parents' marriage deteriorated into something resembling open warfare. The problems between Margaret Tudor and Archibald Douglas had begun even before Margaret Douglas's birth and only worsened as time passed. Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus, was an ambitious man who had married Margaret Tudor partly out of genuine attraction. She was still a handsome woman in her mid-20s, recently widowed and vulnerable, but largely because marriage to the Dowager Queen of Scotland and the regent for the infant king offered enormous potential for political power and personal advancement. However, Archibald's commitment to fidelity proved weak. He took a mistress, a woman named Jane Stewart of Traquair, and he refused to give her up, despite his wife's increasingly furious demands. This was not merely a personal betrayal, though Margaret Tudor certainly felt the sting of personal hurt and humiliation. In the 16th century, a nobleman's sexual behavior was considered largely his own business, and many wives of the aristocracy learned to tolerate their husbands' affairs as an unfortunate but inevitable part of life. But Margaret Tudor was not merely Archibald's wife. She was a queen, the sister of England's king, and a woman who had expected to rule Scotland as regent for her son. Archibald's open infidelity undermined her dignity and her authority. It made her look weak and unable to control even her own husband. It gave her enemies at the Scottish court ammunition to use against her, and it demonstrated that Archibald valued his own desires over his wife's position and feelings. Margaret Tudor's rage was therefore both personal and political. She demanded that Archibald dismiss his mistress. She appealed to church authorities to pressure him. She wrote angry letters to her brother King Henry, complaining of her treatment. And when none of this worked, she began seeking ways to end the marriage entirely. In June 1517, King Henry VIII decided that the best solution to this complicated situation was to send his sister and his niece back to Scotland. He hoped that a period of separation, combined with pressure from various quarters, might lead to reconciliation between Margaret Tudor and Archibald Douglas. He also wanted to restore his sister to some position of influence in Scotland, and where her presence might serve English interests and provide him with reliable information about Scottish affairs. And so, after more than a year in England, Margaret Tudor and the toddler Margaret Douglas made the journey north, crossing back over the border into Scotland and returning to Edinburgh. But the return brought no reconciliation, no restoration of Margaret Tudor's position, and no improvement in the bitter relationship between husband and wife. Instead, what happened next would mark young Margaret's life indelibly and give her first-hand experience of the violence and danger that accompanied royal blood in that turbulent age. Archibald Douglas, calculating that possession was 9/10 of the law, and that controlling his daughter meant controlling her potential value as a pawn in dynastic politics, Wine took the most direct action available to him. He kidnapped his own daughter from her mother's custody. The exact circumstances of this abduction are not entirely clear from surviving records, but what is certain is that Archibald Douglas, using his authority as father and husband, and backed by armed retainers, took young Margaret from her mother's household and transported her to his principal stronghold at Tantallon Castle. This fortress, perched on cliffs overlooking the North Sea in East Lothian, was one of the most formidable castles in Scotland. Its massive red sandstone walls, its commanding position, and its distance from Edinburgh made it nearly impregnable to any force that might try to recover the child. For several years, from perhaps 1518 until 1528, Margaret lived at Tantallon Castle, effectively a prisoner, though probably not experiencing her confinement as such since she was so young. Tantallon became her world, a world of stone walls and sea winds, of Douglas retainers who taught her their fierce family pride, of lessons in riding and hawking, and of constant awareness that her very existence made her valuable to men who sought power. The castle itself was a remarkable place, especially to a child. Built in the mid-14th century, it consisted of a massive curtain wall stretching between towers, with a deep ditch cutting it off from the mainland and making the fortress accessible only by a bridge that could be raised in time of danger. The towers rose high above the cliff tops, and from their upper chambers, Margaret could look out across the grey North Sea stretching to the horizon. On clear days, while she might see ships passing, perhaps English vessels heading north toward the Baltic, or Scottish fishing boats working the cold waters. Behind the castle, the low hills of East Lothian rolled away toward the interior of Scotland. It was beautiful in a stark way, this landscape of rock and sea, of heather-covered hills and windswept cliffs, and it was here that Margaret learned the skills that would serve her throughout her life. She learned to ride, sitting astride a sturdy pony and later progressing to larger horses, learning to control her mount with legs and hands and voice, learning to navigate rough terrain and to jump obstacles. She learned to manage a household, observing the castle's routine and gradually understanding the complex web of duties and relationships that kept a great fortress functioning. She learned to speak both English and Scots, the latter being the language of the common people, and the former being the language of the court and of her powerful relatives in England. She learned to read and write in both Latin and in her native tongues, essential skills for anyone of her rank. And most famously, she learned falconry at Tantallon. The castle was renowned for its hawks, magnificent birds trained to hunt across the moors and cliffs of East Lothian. Margaret learned to fly these birds, to handle them with the delicate touch required, to understand their moods and needs, to launch them from her gloved fist and watch them soar into the sky. Falconry was considered one of the most noble of sports in the 16th century, requiring patience, skill, and courage. That Margaret became accomplished at it. tells us something about her character. She was not content to sit quietly in chambers doing needlework, though she learned that too, but wanted to engage with the wider world and to develop skills that gave her some measure of independence and competence. But this relatively peaceful existence at Tantallon was shattered when Margaret was about 13 years old. Her half-brother, King James V, had reached his teenage years and was determined to assert his royal authority and break free from the control of regents and rival nobles who had dominated his childhood. One of his primary targets was Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus, who had wielded considerable power as the king's stepfather, and who represented everything James had come to hate about the nobles, who had kept him powerless for so long. And James gathered an army and marched on Tantallon Castle, determined to force Archibald Douglas into submission and to break the power of the Douglas family. The siege of Tantallon was a serious military operation, not a mere show of force. James brought artillery, the great cannon that were transforming medieval warfare and making even the strongest castles vulnerable to sustained bombardment. For days, the boom of cannon fire echoed across the East Lothian landscape as iron balls slammed into Tantallon's ancient walls. Young Margaret, sheltered inside the fortress, would have experienced the terror of being under siege, the constant thunder of gunfire, the shuddering impact as stone balls struck the walls, the shouted orders of defenders preparing for assault, the fear that the walls might be breached and the castle taken by storm. One particularly horrific detail, reported by contemporaries, though its accuracy is debated by modern historians, claims that Margaret Tudor herself ordered the cannon to fire on Tantallon Castle, knowing that her daughter was inside. If true, this shows the depth of Margaret Tudor's fury at her estranged husband and her willingness to risk even her daughter's safety to strike at Archibald Douglas. If false or exaggerated, it nevertheless indicates how bitter the warfare between Margaret Tudor and Archibald Douglas had become, such that people could believe she would do such a thing. Tantallon's defences held against the siege. The walls, built thick and strong in an earlier century, proved resistant to the bombardment. The defenders, loyal to Archibald Douglas and well supplied with food and weapons, maintained their resistance. But Archibald Douglas was a practical man who could recognize when a position was becoming untenable. The siege might last for months, and eventually the castle would fall. More importantly, his daughter was trapped inside, and if the castle were taken by storm, there was no guarantee of her safety in the chaos of victory. And so one night, under cover of darkness, while the besieging army slept, Archibald Douglas executed a daring escape. He smuggled his daughter out of the castle through a secret postern gate, a small door that opened onto steep steps carved into the cliff face, leading down to a tiny harbour where a boat waited in the breaking surf. This escape must have been terrifying for young Margaret, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, and being led down dark stone steps in the middle of the night, with waves crashing below and the very real possibility that they might be discovered at any moment. But they made it safely to the boat, and from there began a journey that would become the stuff of family legend. Margaret, her father, and a small group of loyal Douglas retainers became fugitives in their own land, moving through the Scottish lowlands like outlaws, avoiding the king's soldiers who searched for them. They could not travel on main roads where they might be recognized and captured. They could not seek shelter in castles or manor houses where word of their presence might reach the king. Instead, they traveled like common vagabonds, sleeping in barns when they could find them, and in fields when they could not, eating whatever food they could purchase or forage, always moving, always hiding, always aware that discovery could mean death for Archibald and imprisonment for Margaret. The child who had grown up in royal households and castle fortresses now lived like a peasant, sleeping on hay with horses and cattle, eating simple bread and cheese, wearing whatever clothes could be found or borrowed, her red gold hair perhaps hidden under a hood to avoid attracting attention. She learned in those weeks what poverty and fear felt like. She learned that royal blood and noble rank meant nothing when you were hungry and cold and running for your life. She learned to trust a small group of utterly loyal men who risked their own lives to protect her and her father. And she learned that survival sometimes required sacrifice of comfort and dignity. Eventually, after weeks of this dangerous journey, they crossed the border into England, where King Henry VIII's authority could protect them from Scottish pursuit. Margaret must have felt overwhelming relief to be safe at last, though she had traded one kind of uncertainty for another. She would not see her mother again for many years, perhaps never, if some accounts are correct. She would not return to Scotland except briefly and under very controlled circumstances. Her childhood, in any meaningful sense, was over. At 12 or 13 years old, she was about to enter the sophisticated and dangerous world of the Tudor court, where her royal blood and her intelligence would be both assets and dangers. By 1528, when Margaret Douglas was about 13 years old, her life took another dramatic turn that would shape everything that followed. Her father, Archibald Douglas, had managed through various political manoeuvres to temporarily return to some position of authority in Scotland. But rather than bringing his daughter back into that uncertain and dangerous world, he made a decision that would prove crucial for her future. He arranged for Margaret to join the household of her first cousin, Princess Mary, the daughter of King Henry VIII, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. This placement at the English court marked the beginning of Margaret's life as a princess in all but name, living in the royal household, educated alongside the king's own daughter, and treated as a member of the royal family. The household at Beaulieu Palace, also known as New Hall in Essex, where Princess Mary resided with her own establishment of ladies, servants and tutors, represented everything that Margaret's turbulent childhood had lacked: stability, security, luxury, and the sophisticated culture of Renaissance, learning that King Henry actively promoted at his court. Princess Mary and Margaret Douglas, though first cousins, had much in common beyond their blood relationship. They were nearly the same age, Mary being born in February 1516 and Margaret in October 1515, making them separated by only a matter of months. Both had experienced disruption and uncertainty in their young lives, though Mary's difficulties were only beginning as her father's great matter, his desperate attempt to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, was tearing the English court, and indeed all of Christendom, into factions. Both were exceptionally well-educated young women by the standards of their age, and both would prove to have the Tudor stubbornness that could be either a great strength or a fatal flaw depending on circumstances. The friendship that developed between Mary and Margaret would prove to be one of the most important relationships in both their lives. In the uncertainty and danger that characterized life at Henry VIII's court, they found in each other a source of comfort and loyalty. They shared lessons in Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. They studied history, philosophy, and theology. They practiced music together, both being accomplished on various instruments. They did needlework, an essential skill for noble women, but also an art form when practiced at the highest level. They prayed together, both being devout Catholics in an age when religious identity was becoming increasingly contested and dangerous. During these years at Beaulieu, Margaret received an education that would have been extraordinary, even for a royal princess, and was almost unheard of for most women of the age. Her tutors, following the humanist program of studies that had become fashionable among the English aristocracy, taught her classical languages and literature, She learned to read Latin fluently, giving her access to the works of ancient philosophers, historians and poets, as well as to the Latin Vulgate Bible and the vast corpus of medieval theological and philosophical writings. She studied Greek, though probably not to the same level of proficiency as Latin. She became fluent in French, the international language of diplomacy and culture, and she may have acquired some knowledge of Italian and Spanish as well, both useful languages for anyone involved in European politics. But education in the Renaissance extended far beyond book learning. Margaret was trained in all the accomplishments expected of a princess. She learned to dance in the intricate patterns of court dances, where every step and gesture carried meaning, and where grace and poise were essential. She learned to sing, both sacred music for religious observance and secular songs for entertainment. She learned to play various musical instruments, the virginals, a small keyboard instrument popular in English households, the lute, the most fashionable instrument of the age, and perhaps the harp as well. She learned conversation and the art of speaking intelligently and wittily on various subjects without dominating discussion or saying anything that might cause offense. She learned the delicate art of needlework, not the simple sewing required for making clothes, but the elaborate embroidery that decorated altar cloths, wall hangings, and clothing. Hours were spent with needle and colored silks, creating beautiful and complex patterns that demonstrated both artistic skill and patience, and she learned how to conduct herself in the elaborate rituals of court life, when to bow and to whom, how deeply to curtsy based on rank and circumstance, how to walk and sit and stand with the perfect posture expected of nobility, how to eat properly at formal dinners, how to make small talk with visiting dignitaries, how to receive compliments gracefully, and how to deflect unwanted attention politely but firmly. This education was supervised for a time by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who served as Margaret's godfather. Wolsey, the most powerful man in England after the king himself, was at that moment trying desperately to arrange Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, while simultaneously maintaining good relations with the Pope and with the European powers that supported Catherine. It was an impossible task, and Wolsey would eventually fail and fall from power. But during the years when Margaret lived in his household or under his supervision, she had a front row seat to observe the exercise of power at the highest levels. She watched as Wolsey conducted diplomacy, receiving ambassadors from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, negotiating treaties and alliances, and managing the complex web of relationships that constituted European politics in that age. She saw how power could be wielded subtly, through carefully chosen words and strategic gifts, through promises and implied threats, and she learned that even the most powerful could fall when they failed to deliver what their sovereign demanded. When Wolsey was arrested for treason in November 1529, dying on his way to face trial, Margaret witnessed firsthand how quickly fortune could turn in the Tudor court. The years at Beaulieu were also years of tremendous upheaval in English religious and political life. At King Henry's determination to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn was transforming England from a Catholic kingdom under papal authority into something new and unprecedented. A kingdom where the monarch claimed supreme authority in both secular and spiritual matters, where the Church of England would be separated from Rome, and where refusal to accept the king's new religious settlement could mean death for treason. Margaret and Princess Mary watched these events unfold with growing horror, both being deeply attached to the old faith and both personally fond of Queen Catherine. For Princess Mary, the situation was particularly painful. She watched as her mother was sent away from court, forbidden to see her daughter, reduced from Queen of England to Princess Dowager of Wales, denied even the dignity of her former title. Mary herself was declared a bastard, removed from the line of succession, and forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, born to Anne Boleyn in September 1533. The humiliation was intended to break Mary's spirit and force her to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been invalid and that she was therefore illegitimate. But Mary, with Tudor stubbornness, refused to submit, and Margaret supported her cousin through these dark times. Margaret's own position during this period was complicated and somewhat precarious. She was a Catholic like Mary, devoted to the old faith, and opposed to the religious changes sweeping through England. But she was also dependent on King Henry's favour for her support and her position at court. Unlike Mary, who was the king's daughter and could not be entirely cast aside no matter how much she angered him, Margaret had no automatic claim to royal favour. She was the king's niece, valuable as a potential pawn in marriage negotiations, but also potentially dangerous if she chose to ally herself too closely with the Catholic opposition to Henry's policies. When Anne Boleyn was finally crowned Queen of England in June 1533, after years of waiting and struggle and the sundering of England from Rome to make the marriage possible, she established her own household of ladies to serve her. Margaret Douglas, now 17 years old and blossoming into a beauty with her red gold Tudor hair and fair complexion, was appointed as one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. This appointment must have been uncomfortable for Margaret, and given her close friendship with Princess Mary and her sympathy for the displaced Queen Catherine, but she had little choice in the matter. To refuse would have been to invite the king's anger and to risk losing her position at court entirely. Anne Boleyn's court was unlike anything England had seen before. Anne herself was sophisticated, educated and cultured, having spent years at the French court learning the refined manners and artistic patronage that characterized Renaissance courts at their best. She encouraged learning and the arts, surrounding herself with poets, musicians, scholars, and clever conversationalists. She promoted religious reform, supporting scholars who translated the Bible into English and preachers who criticized Catholic practices. She created an atmosphere of intellectual excitement mixed with dangerous religious and political controversy. The Queen's ladies included some of the most accomplished and interesting women of the age. There was Mary Shelton, Anne's young cousin, witty and intelligent. There was Mary Howard, daughter of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, and recently widowed wife of Henry Fitzroy, the King's illegitimate son, a woman of refined taste and literary interests. There was Margaret Wyatt, sister of the poet Sir Thomas Wyatt, whose verses were admired throughout the court, and there were numerous other young women from noble families, all carefully chosen for their loyalty to Anne, their accomplishments, and their ability to ornament the Queen's court. And the atmosphere at Anne's court was one of literary refinement and courtly love traditions mixed with genuine danger. It was fashionable among the young courtiers to write poetry, to engage in elaborate rituals of courtship that were supposedly purely platonic and symbolic, and to exchange clever verses and secret messages. One of the most popular pastimes was the composition and exchange of poetry, with groups of young people passing around notebooks in which they copied their favorite verses, added their own compositions, and wrote replies to each other's work. One such notebook, which would later be preserved in the library of the Dukes of Devonshire, and is now held in the British Library as Additional Manuscript 17,492, became the vehicle for recording the literary culture of Anne Boleyn's court. The manuscript, compiled primarily by three young women, Mary Shelton, Mary Howard, and Margaret Douglas, contains 185 poems plus fragments, anagrams, and other writings. The poems include works by established poets like Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, fragments from medieval writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and Thomas Hoccleve, and original compositions by the women themselves. The Devonshire manuscript, as it is known to scholars today, reveals a world of sophisticated literary play, where emotions were expressed through carefully crafted verses in the tradition of courtly love. This tradition, originating in medieval France and popularized across Europe by troubadours and romance writers, involved an elaborate code of behavior and expression in which a lover declared passionate devotion to a lady who was usually unattainable, either because she was married or because social rank made marriage impossible. The lover expressed his devotion through poetry, music, and symbolic gestures, while the lady maintained a dignified distance, neither entirely encouraging nor entirely discouraging his attentions. In Anne Boleyn's court, this tradition took on new life as young men and women used the language of courtly love to explore feelings that could not be openly acknowledged in the strictly hierarchical and moralistic atmosphere of Tudor England. They wrote poems about unrequited love, about the pain of separation, about the joy of seeing their beloved, about the cruelty of fate that kept lovers apart. And some of these poems were merely literary exercises, clever compositions that demonstrated skill with language and knowledge of poetic conventions. But some revealed genuine emotions, real relationships that had to be hidden behind the veil of literary convention. It was in this atmosphere of literary sophistication and barely contained emotion that Margaret Douglas met Lord Thomas Howard, and their meeting would change both their lives forever. Thomas Howard was the younger son of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, by his second marriage to Agnes Tilney. This made him a member of one of England's most powerful families, the Howards, who had risen to prominence under Henry VII and had consolidated their position through service to Henry VIII. But as a younger son from a second marriage, Thomas had no great inheritance to look forward to. His elder half-brother, also named Thomas Howard, had inherited the dukedom and the vast Howard estates. Lord Thomas Howard himself had to make his way through royal service, through military command, or through advantageous marriage. He was born around 1511 or 1512, making him about 3 or 4 years older than Margaret Douglas. He was moderately tall, slender, with the Howard family's long face and intelligent eyes. He was well educated in the humanities, could read Latin and French, wrote elegant prose and competent poetry, and had all the accomplishments expected of a gentleman: skill with weapons, good horsemanship, ability to dance and make conversation, knowledge of music. He had served at court since his teenage years, had participated in tournaments and court pageants, and had distinguished himself sufficiently to receive some minor royal appointments. But what truly defined Thomas Howard in the eyes of his contemporaries was his relationship to Anne Boleyn. Thomas's father, the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, had married twice. His first marriage had produced Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, who was Anne Boleyn's uncle through her mother, Elizabeth Howard. His second marriage, to Agnes Tilney, had produced several children, including Lord Thomas Howard. This made Lord Thomas technically Anne Boleyn's uncle, though he was actually younger than she was, and they had grown up in the same generation at court. When Anne became queen, Lord Thomas found himself in a favourable position as a member of the royal family by marriage, entitled to attend court ceremonies and participate in the life of the court. Exactly when Margaret Douglas and Thomas Howard first met and began their relationship, we cannot say with certainty. It was probably sometime in late 1535, after both had been at Anne Boleyn's court for some time, and had participated in the literary and social life that characterized that court. They may have been brought together through their participation in compiling the Devonshire manuscript, exchanging poems, and gradually discovering shared interests and sympathies. Or they may have met at one of the countless court events: a masque, a dance, a banquet, a hunt, that brought the young courtiers together in situations where conversation and flirtation were expected and encouraged. And what is certain is that somewhere in the midst of poetry and pageantry, during the long summer days of 1535, when the court moved between various palaces and hunting lodges, enjoying the warm weather and outdoor festivities, Margaret Douglas and Thomas Howard fell deeply and genuinely in love. The poems they wrote to each other, and carefully copied into the Devonshire manuscript, reveal the depth and sincerity of their feelings. These were not merely conventional verses following the formulas of courtly love tradition. They were personal, emotional, and often heartbreakingly honest expressions of love, fear, hope, and despair. Margaret wrote verses celebrating her faithful lover, praising his constancy and his worth. In one poem, as she wrote of taking to her part the faithfulest lover that ever was born, declaring that no woman might ever make such a claim before her, she expressed her determination to remain true to him despite all obstacles, writing that she would keep her fantasy, her love and devotion, even if her heart should burst asunder. These were not the words of a young woman playing at love according to literary convention. They were the words of someone deeply and genuinely attached, willing to risk everything for that attachment. Thomas Howard composed replies promising eternal devotion and celebrating Margaret's perfections. He wrote of his suffering in being separated from her, of his longing to be in her presence, of his determination to remain faithful no matter what trials they faced. His poems reveal a man genuinely in love, and not merely seeking political advantage through marriage to a royal lady, but emotionally committed to a relationship that he must have known was dangerous and potentially impossible, given the vast gulf in rank between a younger son with no great prospects and the niece of the King of England. As winter turned to spring in 1536, Margaret Douglas and Thomas Howard's relationship deepened from courtly flirtation to something far more serious and dangerous. Somewhere during those months, they became secretly engaged, exchanging promises that, in the eyes of many at the time, constituted a binding marriage contract, even without formal church ceremony. They may have gone through some form of private marriage ceremony, speaking vows to each other before witnesses and exchanging rings, creating what was called a clandestine marriage. Or they may have simply made promises to each other that they considered binding regardless of whether church or state recognized them. This was a catastrophically dangerous thing to do, and both Margaret and Thomas must have known it. Under English law, as established by Henry VII and strengthened by Henry VIII, any member of the royal family was absolutely forbidden from marrying without the monarch's explicit permission. This law had been created to prevent exactly the kind of situation that the secret engagement represented, a potential claimant to the throne entering into a marriage that might create complications for succession, might strengthen the position of ambitious nobles, or might create foreign entanglements that the crown had not approved. The penalty for violating this law was severe. Our previous violations had resulted in imprisonment, loss of property, and in some cases, execution for treason. Both parties to an unauthorized royal marriage could be prosecuted, not just the person of royal blood, but also their partner, who would be accused of seducing or entrapping a member of the royal family for personal ambition. Thomas Howard, as a man with no royal blood himself, would be particularly vulnerable to such accusations, which would paint him not as a genuine lover, but as an ambitious schemer trying to advance himself by secretly marrying the king's niece. But young people in love are often optimistic and sometimes foolish. Perhaps Margaret and Thomas believed they could keep their relationship secret until a more opportune time to reveal it. Perhaps they hoped that Queen Anne Boleyn, to who had herself risen to be queen through love rather than through a politically arranged match, might prove sympathetic and intercede with the king on their behalf. Perhaps they thought that if they could present the king with a fait accompli, a marriage already consummated and possibly even producing a child, he would be forced to accept it rather than face the scandal of imprisoning or executing his own niece. Perhaps they simply did not think clearly about the consequences, being young and in love and convinced that their feelings justified any risk. For several months, through late 1535 and into early 1536, they managed to keep their engagement secret. They met when they could, stealing moments of privacy in the maze of rooms and gardens that made up the royal palaces. They wrote poems to each other, and carefully disguising the personal nature of their verses behind the conventions of courtly love, so that anyone reading them might think they were merely literary exercises rather than genuine love letters. They exchanged tokens and gifts. They made plans for a future that would allow them to be together openly, and they navigated the complex and increasingly dangerous atmosphere of Anne Boleyn's court, where factions were forming and where the Queen's hold on power was beginning to seem less secure than it had once appeared. Then came the spring of 1536, and everything changed. On May 2nd, 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn was arrested and charged with adultery, incest and treason. 5 men were arrested along with her, accused of being her lovers: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. The charges were almost certainly false, fabricated by Thomas Cromwell and other royal councillors who had turned against Anne and who knew that the king had tired of his second wife and was already looking toward a third marriage with Jane Seymour. The trials were swift and the verdicts predetermined. The 5 men were convicted and executed on May 17th, 1536, on Tower Hill. Anne herself was tried on May 15th by a special court of peers presided over by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who showed her no mercy. She was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green by an expert swordsman, brought specially from France for the purpose. She died with dignity, and making a brief speech in which she asked people to pray for the king and accepting her fate with courage. The fall of Anne Boleyn sent shockwaves through the court and beyond. Within days, Parliament had declared her marriage to Henry VIII invalid, which conveniently made her daughter Princess Elizabeth illegitimate, just as Princess Mary had been declared illegitimate years earlier. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour on May 30th, 1536, less than 2 weeks after Anne's execution, demonstrating either an ability to move on quickly from grief or, more likely, complete emotional detachment from the woman he had torn England apart to marry just 3 years earlier. In the paranoid atmosphere following Anne's execution, King Henry VIII was alert to any hint of disloyalty, improper behaviour, or threat to the succession. He had just sent 5 men and his own wife to their deaths on what were probably trumped-up charges. He was determined to remarry and finally produce the legitimate male heir who had eluded him despite 3 marriages, and he was suspicious of anyone who might complicate his plans or threaten the Tudor succession. It was in this atmosphere, in early July 1536, that someone informed King Henry about Margaret Douglas's secret engagement to Lord Thomas Howard. We do not know who revealed the secret. It might have been a jealous rival, a worried friend who thought exposure would force the king to be merciful, or simply someone who had observed suspicious behaviour and felt duty-bound to report it. But somehow the king learned of it, and his rage was terrible to behold. King Henry's fury at discovering Margaret's secret engagement had several interconnected sources, each feeding into the others to create a perfect storm of royal rage. First, there was the simple fact of disobedience. His niece, a member of the royal family, whom he had sheltered, supported and favoured, had violated the law forbidding unauthorized royal marriages. This was not merely a personal betrayal. Though Henry certainly felt betrayed by someone he had called his dear niece Meghan, it was a direct challenge to his authority, a demonstration that even members of his own family felt they could disobey his laws and disregard his wishes when it suited them. Second, and perhaps more seriously, there was the question of succession and the security of the Tudor dynasty. In the wake of Anne Boleyn's execution and the declaration that Princess Elizabeth was illegitimate, England found itself in a peculiar constitutional position. Henry VIII had 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Henry Fitzroy. The illegitimate son he had acknowledged and ennobled as Duke of Richmond, but Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared bastards, and Henry Fitzroy, though he carried the king's blood, was indisputably illegitimate and had no legal claim to the throne. This meant that, in the eyes of many, Margaret Douglas stood remarkably high in the line of succession. She was the daughter of Margaret Tudor, King Henry's elder sister, which gave her a strong claim under the principle of inheritance through the female line. She was indisputably legitimate, born to parents who had been legally married at the time of her birth, or she had been born in England, which some argued gave her an advantage over her half-brother James V of Scotland, who had been born north of the border, and she was old enough to marry and produce heirs, which made her claim immediate and practical rather than merely theoretical. For Margaret Douglas to contract an unauthorized marriage at this precise moment was therefore not just a personal transgression, but a potential political crisis. If she were married, her husband would have a claim to rule alongside her should she ever inherit the throne. If she became pregnant and bore a child, that child would be another potential heir, complicating the succession even further. And if her husband were an ambitious man with powerful family connections, he might use his position as consort to a potential queen to advance his own interests and those of his family, potentially threatening the king's authority and the stability of the realm. Third, and perhaps most infuriating to King Henry, was the identity of Margaret's chosen husband. Lord Thomas Howard was the uncle of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had just been executed for treason. He was the nephew of the Duke of Norfolk, who headed one of the most powerful and ambitious families in England. He was connected by blood and alliance to numerous nobles who might harbour resentment against the king or ambitions to control the succession. In Henry VIII's mind, already primed by paranoia and by the recent accusations against Anne Boleyn, the engagement could not be what it appeared, a genuine love match between 2 young people. It must be a conspiracy, a plot by the Howard family to position themselves to seize power should anything happen to the king. Whether there was any truth to this interpretation is highly doubtful. The love poems exchanged between Margaret and Thomas suggest genuine emotion rather than cold political calculation. Thomas Howard was a younger son with no great inheritance and no realistic prospect of wielding political power on his own. Margaret, for all her royal blood, was a woman in a society that severely limited women's ability to exercise power directly. The idea that they had conspired to threaten the Tudor succession seems far-fetched, but in the atmosphere of suspicion and fear that characterized Henry VIII's court in 1536, the innocent appearance of young love was reinterpreted as sinister ambition. On July 18, 1536, Parliament met and passed an Act of Attainder against Lord Thomas Howard. An Act of Attainder was a legislative act that declared someone guilty of treason without requiring a formal trial, condemning them to death and forfeiting their property to the Crown. The Act accused Thomas Howard of attempting to interrupt, impede, and let the said succession of the Crown, meaning he had conspired to interfere with the proper succession to the throne by secretly engaging himself to a potential heir without royal permission. The penalty was death, and all of Thomas's property was declared forfeit to the king. The Act of Attainder against Thomas Howard also included a crucial new provision that would have lasting impact on the royal family. It explicitly stated that henceforth, and any member of the king's family who married without royal permission would be guilty of treason, as would their partner. This strengthened and clarified the existing law, making absolutely clear that unauthorized royal marriages were not merely improper or illegal in a minor way, but were treasonous acts punishable by death. Future generations would feel the weight of this law, as Lady Jane Grey's sister Catherine would discover decades later, when she made the same mistake of marrying without royal permission. Both Margaret Douglas and Lord Thomas Howard were immediately arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. For Thomas, this meant confinement in one of the less comfortable cells in the Tower complex, probably in the Bell Tower, or one of the other towers that had traditionally housed prisoners accused of serious crimes, and he was separated from his family, allowed minimal contact with the outside world, and forced to live in conditions that were harsh even by the standards of the 16th century. The tower's cells were cold in winter and stifling in summer. They were often damp, with water seeping through the old stone walls. Light came through small windows fitted with iron bars. Furniture was minimal. A simple bed, perhaps a table and chair, nothing else. Food was basic, unless the prisoner had money to bribe the guards to bring better provisions. For Margaret, as a member of the royal family, and specifically as the king's niece, conditions were somewhat better, though she was no less a prisoner. She was given apartments rather than a cell, probably in the lieutenant's lodgings, or one of the more comfortable buildings within the tower complex, and she was allowed to keep some servants with her, women to attend to her needs and maintain her dignity. She could have better food, warmer clothing, and the small comforts that made imprisonment bearable rather than brutal. But she was still a prisoner, held at the king's pleasure, with her movements restricted and guards always present, and facing the very real possibility of execution. The Tower of London in July 1536 was a place haunted by recent horror. The scaffold on Tower Green, where Anne Boleyn had been beheaded less than 2 months earlier, had been dismantled, but everyone who entered the tower could look at that spot and remember what had happened there. The places where the 5 men accused with Anne had been executed on Tower Hill were equally visible. The tower was not merely a prison, but a place of death, where many who entered never left alive except to go to their execution. Margaret, imprisoned in this fortress of dread, must have spent her days and nights in a state of terror mixed with desperate hope. She was 20 years old, in love with a man who was imprisoned somewhere in the same fortress, and facing the possibility that her uncle the king would send her to the block as he had sent Anne Boleyn. She knew that royal blood was no guarantee of safety. She had seen how quickly the king could turn on someone he had once favoured. She had witnessed the destruction of Queen Anne, who had once seemed secure in her position as Henry's beloved wife. The poems from this period, carefully copied into the Devonshire manuscript either during imprisonment or shortly after, take on a tone of desperate sorrow and stubborn defiance. One verse, and almost certainly written by Thomas Howard during his imprisonment, speaks of spending his breath in tears in a tower both strong and high for his assured truth, lamenting, the more the ruth, the more the pity. The poem captures the agony of a man imprisoned for the crime of loving, knowing that his love has brought disaster on both himself and the woman he loves, yet unable to renounce that love even to save his own life. Margaret's poetry from this period expresses her determination to remain faithful despite pressure to renounce Thomas. She wrote verses declaring that she would keep her fantasy, her love and devotion, even though she was banished from his presence, even though their enemies did their worst, even though she faced imprisonment and death, and though that I be banished from his speech, his sight, and company, she wrote, yet will I, in spite of his foe, him love and keep my fantasy, do what they will and do their worst, for all they do is vanity, for asunder my heart shall burst, rather than change my fantasy. These were not merely conventional verses following the formulas of courtly love poetry. They were genuine expressions of defiant love, written by a young woman who refused to simply abandon the man she loved, even when doing so might save her life. They reveal Margaret's strength of character, her stubbornness, and her capacity for deep emotional commitment. But they also reveal her youth and perhaps her naivety, her belief that love and loyalty should be enough to overcome the political realities of life as a Tudor princess. As the summer of 1536 wore on, with Margaret and Thomas both imprisoned and the Act of Attainder hanging over Thomas like a death sentence that could be executed at any moment, pressure mounted on Margaret to save herself by renouncing her engagement. Her mother, Margaret Tudor, still in Scotland but terrified for her daughter's life, wrote desperate letters to her brother King Henry begging for mercy. She reminded him that Margaret was their natural daughter, his niece and sister to the King of Scotland. She pleaded that he not pursue extreme rigour against one so tender to them all. She offered to take Margaret back to Scotland if Henry would release her, promising that her daughter would never return to England to trouble him. These letters may have had some effect on the king's thinking, though we cannot know for certain. Henry VIII was capable of both terrible cruelty and genuine affection, often toward the same people at different times. He had loved his niece Margaret and called her Megget with real warmth. He had given her gifts and treated her as a favoured member of his family. But he had also just executed his own wife on probably false charges, so family affection was clearly not an absolute protection against his wrath when he felt threatened or disobeyed. What may have influenced the king more than family affection was practical consideration. If Margaret died in the Tower, it would create diplomatic complications with Scotland, where her half-brother James V might feel obligated to protest or retaliate. If she was executed for treason, it would make Henry look like a tyrant who killed women of his own family for the crime of falling in love. And if she was pregnant with Thomas Howard's child, as rumours suggested, her death would also mean the death of an unborn child of royal blood, which might trouble even Henry's increasingly hardened conscience. Whether these rumours of pregnancy were true, we cannot say with certainty. There is no conclusive evidence either way, but the rumours themselves tell us something about how the relationship between Margaret and Thomas was perceived. People believed that they had not merely exchanged promises, but had consummated their relationship, that they were effectively married, even if no formal ceremony had taken place, and that a child might result from their union. This made the situation even more complicated politically, because if Margaret bore a child, and that child would have royal blood, and would be another potential heir to consider in the tangled question of succession. As summer turned to autumn, Margaret fell seriously ill. The stress of imprisonment, the constant fear of execution, the psychological torment of being separated from Thomas while knowing he was also imprisoned and in danger, and the unhealthy conditions of the Tower all combined to break down her health. She developed a fever, became weak and unable to eat properly, and showed signs of serious illness that alarmed even her jailers. The king's physician was summoned to examine her and reported that she was gravely ill and in danger of death if she remained in the Tower. King Henry, either moved by genuine concern for his niece's health or by practical considerations about the problems her death would cause, made a calculated decision. He ordered that Margaret be moved from the Tower to Syon Abbey, a religious house in Isleworth on the outskirts of London. Syon Abbey was a Brigittine monastery, one of the most prestigious religious houses in England, known for its strict observance and its royal connections. The abbey would be dissolved during Henry's dissolution of the monasteries, but in 1536 it still flourished under the direction of its abbess. Margaret was placed in the custody of Abbess Agnes Jordan, who was instructed to keep her close prisoner while also ensuring she received proper medical care and spiritual guidance. This was still imprisonment, make no mistake. Margaret could not leave the abbey grounds. She could not receive visitors without permission. Her correspondence was monitored. Guards were present to ensure she did not escape. But compared to the Tower, Syon Abbey was comfortable and even pleasant. The buildings were well maintained, the food was good, the accommodations were decent, and the atmosphere was peaceful rather than threatening. At Syon Abbey, Margaret slowly recovered her physical health through the autumn and winter of 1536 to 1537. The Brigittine nuns tended to her with the skill they had developed through years of caring for the sick and elderly. She received proper food, warm clothing, and medical attention. She could walk in the abbey gardens, breathe fresh air, and escape the oppressive atmosphere of the Tower. But even as her body healed, her heart remained troubled. She was separated from Thomas Howard, uncertain of his fate, and under constant pressure to renounce her engagement and declare that she had been deceived or mistaken. The pressure came from multiple sources. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, who had engineered Anne Boleyn's fall and was now the most powerful man in England after the king, wrote to Margaret with barely concealed threats. He reminded her of the king's displeasure and suggested that her continued defiance would lead only to disaster for both herself and Thomas Howard. He urged her to recognize her error, to submit herself entirely to the king's mercy, and to declare that she no longer considered herself engaged to Thomas and had no romantic feelings for him. Abbess Agnes Jordan also applied pressure, though probably from more genuine concern for Margaret's welfare. The abbess would have counselled Margaret that pride and stubbornness were sins, that obedience to lawful authority was a Christian duty, and that her refusal to renounce her engagement was causing unnecessary suffering for both herself and Thomas. The abbess may have genuinely believed that if Margaret would simply submit and apologize, the king would forgive both young people and allow them to resume their lives, perhaps even permitting them to marry properly after a suitable period of penance. Margaret was intelligent enough to understand the reality of her situation. The king held absolute power. Thomas Howard had been condemned by Act of Parliament and faced execution. She herself was a prisoner with no prospect of release unless she gave the king what he wanted. Her mother's pleas from Scotland carried little weight compared to Henry VIII's fury. If she continued to defy him, she might indeed be executed, or she might simply be left to rot in comfortable confinement for years until she was too old and broken to matter anymore. And so, with great reluctance, and probably with tears, Margaret did what was necessary to survive. She wrote to Thomas Cromwell, and through him to the king, declaring that she recognized her error in becoming engaged without royal permission. She stated that she had been deceived by Thomas Howard's attentions and promises. She claimed that she no longer considered herself engaged to him and had no romantic feelings or fancy for him whatsoever. She threw herself entirely on the king's mercy, begging forgiveness for her disobedience and promising never to repeat such an error. We cannot know what Margaret truly felt as she wrote these words. The woman who had written passionate poetry declaring she would love Thomas Howard, even if her heart burst asunder, was now claiming she had never truly loved him at all, that it had all been a mistake or deception, that she was entirely over him. It must have felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed and felt. It must have seemed like a denial of her own heart, her own judgment, her own worth. but it was also the price of survival in a world where royal blood meant you were never truly free to choose your own path. On October 29, 1537, after more than 15 months of imprisonment, Margaret Douglas was released from Syon Abbey. The king, having received her submission and her renunciation of Thomas Howard, was willing to show mercy. She was allowed to return to court, gradually restored to favour, and treated once again as the king's dear niece Margaret. Henry gave her gifts to mark her return to favour. A gilt cup crafted by the goldsmith Morgan Wolfe as a New Year's gift for 1539, expensive fabrics for new gowns, and other tokens of royal affection. It was as if the whole scandal had never happened, as if she had never been imprisoned, as if she had never loved and lost. But the price of Margaret's restoration was paid by Thomas Howard. While she recovered her freedom and her position, Thomas remained imprisoned in the Tower. The Act of Attainder condemning him to death had never been repealed. He had been granted no reprieve, no pardon, no mercy, and he was simply left in his cell, month after month, with no trial, no hope of release, and nothing to sustain him except whatever loyalty and love he still felt for the woman who had publicly renounced him. The conditions in the Tower were harsh for prisoners who lacked resources to bribe guards for better treatment. Thomas Howard, with all his property forfeit to the Crown and his family unwilling or unable to provide much support given his disgrace, likely suffered from malnutrition as much as from despair. The food provided to prisoners without means was minimal and of poor quality. Stale bread, thin soup, perhaps some cheese or dried fish. Clean water was sometimes scarce. The cells were cold and damp, breeding grounds for disease. Medical care was non-existent unless prisoners could pay for physicians to visit them. Thomas fell ill sometime in the autumn of 1537. Whether his illness was caused by the conditions of his imprisonment, by disease that spread through the Tower, as it did through all crowded places in that age, or by simple despair and loss of the will to live, we cannot say. What we know is that on October 31st, 1537, just 2 days after Margaret's release from Syon Abbey, Lord Thomas Howard died in his cell in the Tower of London. He was only about 26 years old, cut down in the prime of life, never having been formally tried or convicted except by Act of Parliament, never having had the chance to defend himself against the charges of treason. His body was given to his mother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, and with strict instructions that it be buried without pomp or ceremony. This was a final humiliation, denying Thomas even the dignity of a funeral appropriate to his rank and family. He was laid to rest at Thetford Abbey in Norfolk, the traditional burial place of the Howard family, with little to mark his passing except the grief of those who had known and loved him. His grave was lost when Thetford Abbey was dissolved during the suppression of the monasteries just a few years later. Its buildings dismantled for their valuable building materials and its burial grounds ploughed under. We do not know exactly when or how Margaret learned of Thomas's death. We do not know whether she was told immediately or whether the news was kept from her for days or weeks. We do not know if she was allowed to mourn openly or whether she had to hide her grief to maintain the fiction that she had never truly loved him. There are no letters, no diary entries, no poems recording her reaction. The historical record is silent on what must have been one of the most painful moments of her life, but we can imagine the shock, the guilt, and the complicated mixture of emotions that must have overwhelmed her. Thomas had died while she lived. He had remained imprisoned while she was released. He had paid the ultimate price for their love, while she had saved herself by renouncing him. The knowledge that her freedom had been purchased at least partly by abandoning him must have weighed on her conscience for the rest of her life, and the awareness that he had died alone, sick, probably believing she had betrayed him, must have been almost unbearable. Thomas Howard's nephew, the poet Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, later wrote verses that may reference his uncle's death. In a poem to Lady Elizabeth Fitzgerald, Surrey wrote, "If you be fair and fresh, am I not of your hue? And for my vaunt I dare well say, my blood is not untrue. For you yourself doth know, it is not long ago, since that for love one of the race did end his life in woe. In tower both strong and high, for his assured truth, whereas in tears he spent his breath. Alas, the more the ruth." The lines suggest that within the Howard family, Thomas was remembered as a victim of the king's paranoia, rather than as a traitor, a man who died for love rather than for ambition, whose only crime was falling in love with the wrong woman. But this recognition, this vindication of his character, it came too late to save him. He was already dead, already buried without honour, already forgotten by most of the court that had once known him. For Margaret Douglas, life had to continue despite the tragedy of Thomas Howard's death. She was 22 years old when he died, no longer the naive girl who had fallen in love with a charming courtier, but a woman who had learned harsh lessons about the price of love and the limits of personal choice for someone of royal blood. She had survived imprisonment, serious illness, and the death of her first love. She had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, to submit when submission was necessary, and to hide her true feelings behind the mask that courtiers were required to wear. King Henry VIII, having made his point about the consequences of unauthorized royal marriages, was willing to let bygones be bygones. He gave Margaret a gilt cup crafted by the goldsmith Morgan Wolfe as a New Year's gift for 1539, a signal to the entire court that she was fully restored to favour and should be treated with the respect due to a member of the royal family. She resumed her duties as a lady-in-waiting, this time in the household of Jane Seymour, who had become Henry's third wife shortly after Anne Boleyn's execution. Jane Seymour's household was quieter and less intellectually stimulating than Anne Boleyn's court had been. Jane was a conventional woman who promoted traditional values, Catholic-leaning religious observance, despite being married to the king who had broken with Rome, and domestic tranquility rather than the excitement and controversy that had characterized Anne's time as queen. For Margaret, who had been traumatized by the events of the previous 2 years, this quieter atmosphere may have been a relief. She could perform her duties, attend religious services, do her needlework, and participate in court life without the constant undercurrent of danger that had pervaded Anne Boleyn's court. When Jane Seymour died in October 1537, just days after finally giving birth to the male heir that King Henry had sought for so long, Margaret participated in the funeral ceremonies and then continued her service in the household arrangements for the young Prince Edward. But Margaret's own behaviour suggests that the lessons of her imprisonment and Thomas Howard's death had not entirely taught her caution. In 1540, she found herself in another scandal, though a lesser one than the first. This time, and the object of her affection was Sir Charles Howard, the half-nephew of her dead love Thomas Howard, and the brother of Catherine Howard, who had recently become Henry VIII's fifth wife. Charles Howard was the son of Lord Edmund Howard, Thomas Howard's elder half-brother, making Charles part of the sprawling Howard family network, but with relatively little wealth or influence of his own. What attracted Margaret to Charles is unclear. Perhaps she was drawn to him because of his connection to Thomas, seeing in the younger man some echo of the man she had loved. Perhaps it was rebellion against the control that had been forced upon her, a way of asserting that she could still choose whom to love, even if the consequences were harsh. Perhaps it was simply loneliness and a desire for companionship with someone who understood the world of the court. Whatever the reason, when Margaret's relationship with Charles Howard was discovered, and at Henry VIII's court, few secrets remained secret for long, she found herself in disgrace once again. But this scandal was less serious than the first. Charles Howard had no royal ambitions, and there was no suggestion that Margaret had tried to marry him or even become formally engaged. It appears to have been a flirtation or love affair rather than anything that threatened the succession. Nevertheless, the king was displeased, and Margaret was once again sent away from court, this time back to Syon Abbey, for a period of penance and reflection. The punishment was relatively mild compared to her earlier imprisonment, as she was not held in the tower. There was no act of attainder. There was no threat of execution. She was simply removed from court for a suitable period to demonstrate that the king disapproved of her behaviour, and then, after a few months, she was allowed to return. By 1543, she had regained enough favour to serve as one of the witnesses at King Henry VIII's marriage to his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. The wedding took place on July 12, 1543, at Hampton Court Palace. It was a relatively small and private ceremony compared to some of Henry's earlier marriages, perhaps because the king was now aging and ill, his leg ulcers causing him constant pain, and his enormous weight-making movement difficult. Catherine Parr was a twice-widowed woman in her early 30s, intelligent, educated, and capable. She was a convinced religious reformer, sympathetic to Protestant ideas, though careful not to push the king too far given his unpredictable moods. And she proved to be an excellent stepmother to Henry's 3 children, bringing them together and creating something approaching a normal family life for the first time in years. Margaret became one of Queen Catherine's chief ladies, and the two women developed a genuine friendship. They had known each other for many years, both having been part of the court circle since the 1520s, and they shared interests in learning, religion, and the arts. Catherine Parr was establishing a small court of her own that promoted religious scholarship, translation work, and humanist learning. She encouraged her ladies to read scripture in English, to discuss theological questions, and to develop their minds as well as their skills in traditional feminine accomplishments. For Margaret, who had been well educated in her youth, but had seen little opportunity to exercise her intellectual abilities in the years since, this atmosphere must have been stimulating and welcome. It was during Catherine Parr's queenship that Margaret's life took its most important turn. In 1544, when Margaret was approaching 29 years old, and likely considered past the ideal age for a first marriage, by the standards of the time, King Henry arranged a match for her with Matthew Stewart, the 4th Earl of Lennox. This marriage, unlike her doomed love affair with Thomas Howard, was a carefully calculated political arrangement designed to serve the interests of the English crown, while providing Margaret with a suitable husband and establishment of her own. Matthew Stewart, 4th Earl of Lennox, was a Scottish nobleman with an impressive pedigree, but a complicated political history. He was born in 1516, making him about a year younger than Margaret. He was descended from King James II of Scotland through the Stuart line, which gave him a claim to the Scottish throne that rivaled that of the Hamilton family, who currently held the position of heir presumptive to King James V. His full title was Matthew Stewart, 4th Earl of Lennox and 6th Lord Darnley, the latter being an English title that came through his mother, Elizabeth Stewart, daughter of John Stewart, 3rd Earl of Lennox. Lennox had been involved in Scottish politics from a young age, allying himself at various times with different factions in the constant struggles for power that characterized 16th century Scotland. But his most significant political action had been his participation in the War of the Rough Wooing, the brutal English military campaign intended to force a marriage between the infant Mary Queen of Scots and the young Prince Edward of England. Lennox had allied himself with England during this conflict, fighting against his own countrymen, and particularly against the Hamilton family, his rivals for influence in Scotland. This decision to side with England against Scotland had resulted in Lennox being declared a traitor by the Scottish government. His Scottish estates were forfeit, his titles in Scotland were revoked, and he was exiled from his homeland. For several years he had been living in England, dependent on King Henry's favour for his support and looking for an opportunity to recover his position. He was charming, reasonably intelligent, and ambitious, though he lacked the political skills and judgment that would have made him truly effective as a leader. What he had was royal blood, a claim to the Scottish throne, and a willingness to serve English interests. King Henry VIII saw in this situation an opportunity to create a useful alliance. By marrying Margaret Douglas to the Earl of Lennox, he would link English royal blood with a Scottish claimant to the throne, creating a family whose children would have strong claims to both kingdoms. Such children could serve English interests in Scotland, potentially providing an alternative to Mary Queen of Scots and the pro-French faction that dominated the Scottish government. At the same time, the marriage would provide Margaret with a suitable husband of appropriate rank, resolve the question of her future, and remove the possibility of another scandal like the Thomas Howard affair. For Margaret, the proposed marriage must have provoked complicated feelings. She was being given no choice in the matter. The king had decided, and she would obey or face consequences. The man she was to marry was a stranger, someone she had probably seen at court but never really known personally. He was younger than she was, which reversed the usual pattern of older husbands and younger wives. He was an exile from his own country with little prospect of recovering his position in Scotland. And he wasn't the love match she had dreamed of in her youth, not the passionate romance with Thomas Howard that had nearly destroyed her. But Margaret was also practical and had learned from bitter experience. She was 28 years old, which by 16th century standards was dangerously close to being too old for a first marriage. She had no dowry of her own, being dependent on the king's generosity for any marriage portion. She had been involved in 2 scandals that had damaged her reputation and made her less attractive as a marriage prospect, and she probably understood that this might be her only chance at marriage, motherhood, and an establishment of her own. Better to marry Matthew Stewart, Earl of Lennox, under the king's favour and with royal support, than to remain an unmarried hanger-on at court, growing old serving other queens and eventually being forgotten. The marriage contract was negotiated through the spring of 1544. King Henry was generous, perhaps feeling some guilt over the hardships Margaret had endured, or perhaps simply eager to seal the alliance. He provided a substantial dowry and agreed to grant the couple significant estates in England that would give them an independent income. The marriage took place on July 6, 1544, at St. James's Palace in London, with King Henry VIII himself and Queen Catherine Parr in attendance to give their blessing to the union. According to some accounts, the king told Margaret on her wedding day that if his own children should die without heirs of their own, he would be glad if heirs of her body succeeded to the crown. And whether he actually said this, or whether it was a later fabrication designed to bolster the claims of Margaret's descendants, we cannot say with certainty, but it reflects the reality that Margaret's marriage to Lennox created a family with powerful claims to both the English and Scottish thrones, claims that would become increasingly important as the 16th century progressed. As a wedding gift, King Henry granted the newlyweds the estate of Temple Newsam in Yorkshire. Temple Newsam was a substantial property with a fine house, extensive lands, and good income from rents and agriculture. It had originally been property of the Knights Templar, dissolved in the 14th century, and had passed through various hands before coming to the crown. The house itself had been substantially rebuilt in recent decades and was one of the finest residences in the north of England, suitable for a couple of Margaret and Lennox's rank. It would become their principal residence and the place where Margaret would spend much of the rest of her life. What began as a political arrangement appears to have developed into genuine affection and partnership. Unlike many arranged marriages that remained cold business transactions throughout their duration, Margaret and Lennox seem to have grown to care for each other. They were both intelligent people who understood dynastic politics. They shared ambitions for their family's advancement. They were both willing to work hard to recover and improve their position. And they found in each other partners who could be trusted in a world where trust was rare and betrayal common. In the early years of their marriage, from 1544 onward, Margaret and Matthew Stewart, Earl of Lennox, established themselves at Temple Newsam and began the difficult work of building a family and a future together. The house that King Henry had given them was magnificent, a sprawling Tudor mansion set in extensive parkland in the West Riding of Yorkshire near the town of Leeds. The property stretched for miles, encompassing farmland, forests and hunting grounds. The house itself was built of warm red brick in the fashionable Tudor style, with large windows that let in light, numerous chimneys indicating many fireplaces for warmth, and elaborate decorative details that demonstrated wealth and status. And Temple Newsam became Margaret's refuge and her kingdom. Here, far from the court and its dangers, she could create a household according to her own preferences. She could worship as she chose, maintaining Catholic practices despite the religious changes sweeping through England. She could surround herself with loyal servants and dependents who owed their positions to her rather than to some greater power. She could manage estates, make decisions about agriculture and tenant relationships, and exercise a kind of authority that would have been impossible at court, where she was always subject to the king's will and the jealousies of rivals. The house required an enormous staff to function properly. There were stewards to manage the estates and collect rents from tenants. There were bailiffs to supervise agricultural work and ensure that the farms were productive. There were household servants of every description, grooms for the stables, cooks and kitchen staff for the elaborate meals that were served daily, chambermaids to clean and maintain the numerous rooms, laundresses to wash the mountains of linens and clothing, gardeners to tend the ornamental gardens and produce vegetables for the household, and personal servants to attend directly on Margaret and Lennox. There were also more specialized positions that reflected the elevated status of the household. Margaret employed a chaplain to say Mass in her private chapel, a position that required careful management during the increasingly Protestant reign of Edward VI, but that Margaret insisted on maintaining. She had ladies-in-waiting of her own, daughters of gentry families who came to learn courtly manners and hopefully make good marriages through the connections they formed in Margaret's household. There were musicians to provide entertainment, tutors to educate any children who might be born, and the various craftspeople, seamstresses, embroiderers, silversmiths, and others, whose skills were needed to maintain a noble household. Running this complex establishment required constant attention to detail and considerable organizational skill. Margaret had to manage budgets, approve expenditures, settle disputes among servants, maintain relationships with neighboring gentry families, correspond with court officials about various legal and financial matters, and generally serve as the mistress of a small community. It was exhausting work, but it was also empowering in a way that life at court had never been. At Temple Newsam, Margaret was not a supplicant dependent on royal favour, but a great lady in her own right, mistress of a magnificent estate, and a person of consequence in the region. But all of this paled in importance compared to Margaret's central preoccupation in the early years of her marriage, producing children, particularly sons, who would carry forward the claims and ambitions of the Stuart Douglas line. In the 16th century, A woman's primary duty was to provide heirs, and for women of royal blood, this duty was even more important, because those heirs might one day inherit kingdoms. Margaret understood this well, and she and Lennox set about the task of creating a family with the same determination they brought to all their endeavours. In November 1545, Margaret gave birth to her first child, a son named Henry, after both King Henry VIII and after Lennox's own family traditions. The birth of a son was always cause for celebration in noble families, and Margaret must have been overjoyed to have fulfilled the first and most important duty of a wife by providing a male heir. But that joy was cruelly brief. The infant Henry died shortly after birth, or within the first few weeks of life. The historical record does not preserve the exact details of his death, whether it was a difficult birth that injured the baby, whether he failed to thrive despite wet nurses and medical attention, or whether he simply succumbed to one of the many illnesses that killed infants in that age of limited medical knowledge and no understanding of hygiene or infection. And the death of a first child was heartbreaking for any parent, but Margaret had little time to grieve before she was pregnant again. In December 1545, just weeks after losing her first son, she gave birth to another boy, also named Henry. This practice of reusing names from deceased children was common in the 16th century, reflecting both the high rate of infant mortality and the importance of particular family names. Parents would often name multiple children after the same person, hoping that at least one would survive to carry on the name and the heritage it represented. This second Henry, born at Temple Newsome on December 7th, 1545, would survive infancy and childhood to become Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, the most important figure in Margaret's life and the vehicle for her greatest ambitions. His birth must have brought immense relief to Margaret, who now had a living son, an heir to carry forward the family claims. But even this relief was tempered by the knowledge of how fragile infant life was, and how easily this child too might be taken from her. Margaret threw herself into caring for her surviving son with all the intensity of a mother who has already lost one child and is determined not to lose another. She would have employed the best wet nurses available, women with good milk and healthy dispositions who could provide the nutrition the baby needed. She would have consulted with physicians about the child's health, watching for any signs of illness or weakness. She would have ensured that he was kept warm in winter and cool in summer, protected from drafts and from the illnesses that swept through even the cleanest households in that age. As young Henry grew from infant to toddler to child, Margaret began to plan for his education and his future. She understood that her son was not merely the heir to the Earldom of Lennox, substantial though that title was. He was a prince of the blood, carrying the royal bloodlines of both England and Scotland. Through his grandmother Margaret Tudor, he was a great-grandson of Henry VII of England. Through his father, he was descended from the royal house of Stuart and had a claim to the Scottish throne that rivaled that of the Hamilton family. And through both parents, he had claims that could be pressed to the English throne should circumstances make that possible or necessary. Margaret was determined that her son would be educated as befitted a potential king. She hired the best tutors available, men trained in the humanist tradition who could teach Henry languages, literature, history, philosophy, and all the learning that characterized Renaissance education. Young Henry learned Latin and became fluent enough to read classical authors in their original language. He learned French, essential for anyone who might be involved in international diplomacy or who aspired to move in the highest circles of European nobility. He studied history, learning about the great leaders of the past and the lessons their lives might teach about power, virtue, and political success. But education for a noble boy involved much more than books and languages. Our Henry was trained in all the physical accomplishments expected of a gentleman and potential warrior. He learned to ride, starting with gentle ponies as a small child, and graduating to larger, more spirited horses as he grew older and more skilled. He learned swordplay, practicing first with wooden swords and later with blunted steel blades, developing the strength, speed, and technique needed to fight effectively. He learned to joust, the spectacular martial sport that was both entertainment and training for warfare. He was taught archery, an essential military skill in 16th century England, despite the growing importance of firearms. He was also trained in the courtly accomplishments that would allow him to shine in royal courts. He learned to dance, mastering the complex steps and patterns of various court dances. He learned to play musical instruments, particularly the lute, which was considered the most sophisticated and fashionable instrument of the age. He was taught to sing, both for pleasure and for participation in the part songs and madrigals that were popular entertainment. He learned the art of conversation, how to speak wittily and intelligently on various subjects without dominating discussion or causing offense, and he was drilled in courtly manners, learning the elaborate protocols of precedence, the proper forms of address for various ranks, and all the rituals that govern behavior in the presence of royalty. Margaret ensured that her son understood his royal heritage and his potential destiny. She told him stories about his grandmother Margaret Tudor, about the great kings of England and Scotland from whom he was descended, about the power and glory that might one day be his if he proved worthy and if circumstances aligned correctly. She taught him to carry himself with the confidence and dignity of a prince, to expect deference from those of lower rank, and to understand that his blood made him different from and superior to ordinary nobles. This education in royal pride and ambition would serve young Henry well in some ways, giving him the confidence to pursue a crown, but it would also prove disastrous in others, making him arrogant, demanding, and unable to accept limits on his power. While Margaret focused on raising her eldest son, she also continued to bear children, hoping to provide Darnley with brothers who could support him and serve the family interests. In 1557, and when Margaret was 41 years old, quite elderly for childbearing by 16th century standards, she gave birth to another son named Charles. Charles Stuart would survive childhood, giving Margaret 2 living sons, though the numerous other pregnancies she experienced resulted in children who died in infancy or were stillborn. She bore at least 4 daughters whose names were never recorded, and who all died too young to leave any mark on history. She may have had as many as 8 or 9 children in total, though the exact number is unclear from surviving records. This pattern of frequent pregnancies resulting in mostly dead babies was common among women of Margaret's class and era. Without any understanding of prenatal care, nutrition, hygiene, or the causes of infant mortality, to even wealthy women who could afford the best medical attention available, often lost more children than they raised to adulthood. Each pregnancy carried risks for the mother as well, and many women died in childbirth or from complications following delivery. That Margaret survived all her pregnancies and lived to age 62 is itself somewhat remarkable, suggesting that she was fundamentally healthy and strong despite the traumas and stresses of her life. The loss of so many children must have been a constant sorrow, a background of grief that accompanied all of Margaret's other concerns and activities. Each baby born dead or dying shortly after birth represented hopes crushed, plans thwarted, and the physical pain and danger of childbirth endured for nothing. Each unnamed daughter who died in infancy was a potential future marriage alliance lost, a possible source of comfort and companionship in Margaret's old age that would never materialize. The fact that only 2 sons survived out of perhaps 8 or 9 children must have made Margaret fiercely protective of those 2, and determined to ensure that their lives counted for something, that they achieved the greatness that her dead children would never have the chance to pursue. During these years at Temple Newsam, from 1544 through the early 1550s, Margaret and Lennox also worked to build their political position and recover some of what Lennox had lost through his exile from Scotland. They maintained correspondence with various factions in Scotland, offering support and seeking opportunities, and they cultivated relationships with powerful figures at the English court, ensuring that they were not forgotten despite their distance from London. And they quietly maintained their Catholic faith despite the increasingly Protestant direction of English religious policy under the regents who governed for the young King Edward VI. King Henry VIII had died on January 28, 1547, when his son Edward was only 9 years old. The boy king was intelligent and deeply committed to Protestant reform, but actual power was exercised by a regency council dominated by Protestant nobles who saw the Catholic minority as a threat to be suppressed. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, served as Lord Protector and pursued aggressive Protestant policies, dissolving chantries and religious guilds, requiring the use of the English Book of Common Prayer, and generally pushing England toward a more radical Protestantism than even Henry VIII had embraced. For Catholic families like the Lennoxes, this was a dangerous time. They could not openly practice their faith without risking prosecution. Catholic Mass was illegal, the old Latin liturgy was forbidden, and religious images and decorations that had adorned churches for centuries were being destroyed as idolatrous. But the law did provide one loophole. Great nobles with private chapels in their own homes were permitted to conduct religious services according to their own preferences, provided they attended the parish church for official services as required by law. This exemption allowed Margaret and Lennox to maintain Catholic worship at Temple Newsam, while appearing to conform outwardly to the official religious settlement. Margaret employed Catholic priests as her chaplains, men who said Mass in Latin using the traditional liturgy, who heard confessions and provided the sacraments, and who maintained the old devotional practices that were being suppressed elsewhere. She made sure that her sons were raised as Catholics, learning the prayers and rituals of the old faith, understanding themselves as part of the Catholic community, even if that community was increasingly beleaguered in Protestant England. This religious identity would prove crucial in their later careers, particularly for Darnley, whose Catholicism would make him attractive as a potential husband for Mary Queen of Scots, but would also make him suspect in the eyes of Protestant English politicians. Margaret and Lennox generally avoided the court during Edward VI's reign. They were not wanted there. Protestant regents had little use for Catholic nobles whose loyalty to the new religious order was questionable, and they preferred to remain in Yorkshire, where they could live according to their own preferences without constant scrutiny. They focused on managing their estates, raising their children, and waiting for circumstances to change. They maintained a luxurious lifestyle at Temple Newsam, entertaining neighbours, hunting in their extensive parks, and generally living as great nobles should. But they also kept their eyes on political developments, watching for opportunities to advance their family's interests. The opportunity they were waiting for came in July 1553, when King Edward VI died of tuberculosis at age 15. The king had been in declining health for months, coughing blood and wasting away despite the best efforts of his physicians. Before his death, he had been persuaded by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, to alter the succession. Instead of allowing his elder sister Mary to inherit the throne as specified in their father's will, Edward declared that the crown should pass to Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary Tudor, who had recently been married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley. This attempt to place Jane Grey on the throne failed spectacularly. Within 9 days, Mary Tudor had rallied support across England, had ridden into London in triumph, and claimed the throne that was rightfully hers. Jane Grey, her husband, and the Duke of Northumberland were all arrested and eventually executed for treason. And England had its first undisputed Queen Regnant, a Catholic monarch determined to restore the old faith and undo the Protestant reforms of her brother's reign. For Margaret Douglas, the accession of her first cousin and lifelong friend Princess Mary to the throne as Queen Mary I was the answer to years of prayers and hopes. Mary's triumph meant that Catholics were no longer a persecuted minority, but the favoured group, that the old faith would be restored, and that Margaret herself would return to a position of favour and influence at court. Within weeks of Mary's coronation, Margaret travelled from Yorkshire to London to pay her respects to the new Queen and to reclaim her place among the royal family. Queen Mary received her cousin with great warmth and affection. The two women had been close since childhood, when they had shared lessons and prayers at Beaulieu Palace in the late 1520s and early 1530s. They had supported each other through the difficult years when Anne Boleyn was queen, and when both had been in varying degrees of disfavour or danger. They shared the Catholic faith that was central to both their identities, and they shared the experience of being royal women in a world that offered them few choices and many dangers. Mary trusted Margaret as she trusted few others, and she showered her cousin with honours and gifts. Margaret was given magnificent apartments at Westminster Palace, the medieval royal residence where English monarchs had traditionally maintained their principal London establishment. These were not modest rooms tucked away in some corner, but the kind of grand apartments appropriate for a princess of the blood, with high ceilings, large windows, fine furnishings, and all the comforts that marked status and favour. Margaret was provided with an income to maintain her household and dress herself appropriately. She was given precedence over many other noble ladies, walking immediately after the Queen's own family in ceremonial processions and sitting near the Queen at formal dinners and entertainments. Most importantly, Mary made it clear that she considered Margaret to be a potential heir to the throne. Although Mary hoped to marry and produce children of her own, who would inherit the crown, she was already 37 years old and had suffered from various health problems that might affect her ability to bear children. If Mary died without heirs, who should succeed her? Her younger sister Elizabeth was still legally a bastard, her legitimacy never having been formally restored after Henry VIII had declared her illegitimate following Anne Boleyn's execution. In Catholic eyes and according to Catholic law, Elizabeth remained illegitimate and therefore unable to inherit. This left Margaret Douglas as the next logical heir, according to many interpretations of the succession law. She was the legitimate daughter of Henry VIII's legitimate sister, Margaret Tudor. She had been born in England, and which some argued gave her an advantage over claimants born in Scotland. She was a Catholic, which meant she would continue Mary's work of restoring the old faith if she inherited, and she was a mature woman with a husband and a son, offering continuity and stability rather than the uncertainties that might come with a younger, unmarried female heir. The Spanish ambassador, Simon Renard, reported to his master that Queen Mary had told him she believed Margaret was best suited to succeed her to the throne. This was an extraordinary statement, suggesting that Mary had given serious thought to the succession question and had concluded that Margaret would make a better queen than Elizabeth. Whether Mary would have followed through on this preference, or whether Parliament would have accepted Margaret's claim over Elizabeth's, we can never know. But the fact that the possibility was being discussed at the highest levels shows how far Margaret had come and how close she was, for a brief moment, to potentially inheriting the throne of England. Margaret participated fully in the ceremonies and celebrations of Mary's reign. She was one of the most prominent ladies at Queen Mary's wedding to Philip of Spain, which took place at Winchester Cathedral on July 25th, 1554. This marriage was deeply unpopular in England, where many feared that it would make England subordinate to Spanish interests and would drag the country into Spain's wars with France. But Margaret, as a loyal Catholic and a faithful supporter of the Queen, supported the marriage and served as one of the chief witnesses and participants in the elaborate ceremonies. The wedding was magnificent, with all the splendor that Mary could command despite the financial difficulties that plagued her government. The cathedral was decorated with cloth of gold, magnificent tapestries, and elaborate floral arrangements. The Queen wore a gown of rich purple velvet, with a jeweled collar worth more than many nobles' annual income. Prince Philip arrived in England with a vast retinue of Spanish nobles, clergy and servants, bringing gifts and creating a spectacle designed to impress the English people with Spanish power and magnificence. Margaret, dressed in her finest clothes and wearing the jewels appropriate to her rank, walked in the procession and witnessed the exchange of vows that made Mary Tudor a Spanish queen consort, as well as an English queen regnant. But as Mary's reign progressed, and it became clear that the Queen's hopes for a Catholic restoration and a happy marriage were not going to be fulfilled as she had hoped. Her marriage to Philip produced no children, despite prayers and even false pregnancies that raised and then crushed her hopes. The persecution of Protestants, which saw hundreds of men and women burned at the stake for heresy, made Mary increasingly unpopular and earned her the nickname Bloody Mary that has survived to this day. Her subordination of English interests to Spanish policy, particularly her agreement to join Spain in war against France, led to the loss of Calais, England's last possession on the continent, and a devastating blow to English pride. Margaret watched these developments with concern, but remained loyal to her cousin the Queen. She attended court regularly and participated in religious ceremonies, and generally made herself useful and supportive. She also used her access to the Queen to advance her own family's interests, particularly the cause of restoring her husband Lennox to his Scottish estates and titles. Mary was sympathetic to this cause, seeing Lennox as a fellow Catholic who had suffered for his faith and his loyalty to England. She wrote letters supporting his restoration and made diplomatic overtures to the Scottish government. But the Scottish government, dominated by Protestant lords and by the Hamilton family, who were Lennox's rivals, refused to restore him. They remembered his betrayal of Scotland during the War of the Rough Wooing, and they saw him as an English agent who would serve English interests rather than Scottish ones if he were allowed to return to Scotland. The situation was made more complicated by the fact that Scotland's young queen, Mary, was in France, married to the Dauphin Francis, who would soon become King of France. The Scottish government was under the influence of Mary's French mother, Mary of Guise, who served as regent and who had no particular reason to favour an English-backed Catholic noble like Lennox. Margaret was also focused during these years on continuing to raise and educate her son Darnley, who was growing into a tall, handsome young man. By the mid-1550s, Darnley was in his early teens, and Margaret was increasingly conscious that he represented the family's best hope for achieving greatness. She brought him to court when appropriate, introducing him to Queen Mary and to other important figures, as ensuring that he was seen and remembered as a prince of the blood. She continued to invest heavily in his education, hiring the best tutors and ensuring that he developed all the skills and accomplishments that would be needed if he were to make an advantageous marriage or pursue a crown. Darnley was growing up handsome and accomplished, which pleased his mother greatly. He was over 6 feet tall, unusual for the time, and especially notable given that most people of that era were considerably shorter than modern populations. He had the Stuart good looks, a long face, fine features, and an elegant bearing. He had inherited the red gold Tudor hair from his mother's side of the family, which marked him clearly as descended from Henry VII. He could dance beautifully, play the lute skillfully, sing pleasantly, and converse intelligently in both English and French. He was good at the physical sports appropriate to his rank: riding, hunting, jousting, and swordplay. But Darnley's character was already showing the flaws that would eventually destroy him. He was vain, arrogant, and convinced of his own superiority. He had an exaggerated sense of his own importance and capabilities, partly because his mother had spent his entire childhood telling him that he was destined for greatness. He lacked the patience, judgment, and self-control that were needed to navigate the complex political situations he would eventually face. He was capable of charm when he wanted something, but he could also be petulant and demanding when crossed. He drank heavily even as a teenager, a habit that would grow worse as he got older, and he had a cruel streak that manifested in his treatment of social inferiors and his willingness to betray those who trusted him. Margaret either did not see these flaws or chose to overlook them, seeing only the potential for greatness that she believed her son embodied. She had invested too much, emotionally, financially, and politically, in Darnley, to admit that he might not be the perfect prince she had imagined, and she continued to believe that with the right marriage, the right opportunities, and the right support, Darnley would fulfill all the hopes she had for him and vindicate all the sacrifices she had made. Margaret was one of the chief mourners at Queen Mary's funeral in December 1558, when the Queen finally succumbed to the illness that had plagued her for months. Mary died at age 42, and disappointed in her hopes for a child, estranged from her husband Philip, who had spent most of their marriage in Spain or the Netherlands, and aware that her efforts to restore Catholicism to England had largely failed. With her death, the throne passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, despite Mary's preference for Margaret Douglas. Elizabeth's claim was simply too strong to be denied. She was Henry VIII's daughter. She had substantial support among the Protestant majority in England, and she moved quickly to secure her position before anyone could challenge her. The accession of Elizabeth I to the throne of England on November 17, 1558, marked a dramatic reversal of fortune for Margaret Douglas. Elizabeth was everything that Mary had not been: Protestant, young, vigorous, politically astute, and determined to establish her authority over a kingdom that had been torn by religious conflict and misgovernment. She was also deeply suspicious of all her relatives who had claims to the throne, and she had particular reason to distrust Margaret, who had been Mary's close friend and who represented a Catholic alternative to Elizabeth's Protestant rule. Elizabeth made it immediately clear that Margaret was not welcome at court. She participated in Mary's funeral, as was appropriate given her rank, and she was allowed to participate in Elizabeth's coronation ceremonies, though not in any particularly prominent role. But once these formalities were complete, Elizabeth essentially banished Margaret from court, making it clear through actions, if not through explicit words, that the new queen had no use for her Catholic cousin, and no desire to have her anywhere nearby where she might serve as a focus for Catholic discontent or conspiracies. Margaret and Lennox returned to Yorkshire, to Temple Newsam, and to their other northern properties. This removal from court was presented as voluntary retirement, a great lady choosing to spend time on her estates rather than at court, but everyone understood it was effectively an exile. Elizabeth did not trust Margaret, and she wanted her far away from London, where she could keep an eye on her through spies and local officials, but where she could not directly threaten the Queen's position or authority. But this exile from court did not mean retirement from politics or abandonment of ambitions. Indeed, The years from 1558 to 1565 would see Margaret engage in the most dangerous and ambitious scheming of her life. A carefully orchestrated plan to place her son Darnley on the throne of Scotland beside Mary Queen of Scots, and thereby position the next generation of her family to inherit both the Scottish and English crowns. It was a plan years in the making, requiring patience, careful timing, and considerable risk, and it would almost succeed, though ultimately it would bring tragedy rather than triumph. Temple Newsam, far from the court, but still within the realm of England, became the centre of Margaret's world during these years. The house and its surrounding estates provided income sufficient to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, and though never as lavish as Margaret would have preferred given her royal blood and her sense of her own importance, she maintained a large household, perhaps 50 or 60 people all told, including family members, ladies-in-waiting, chaplains, household servants, and estate workers. She entertained neighbouring gentry families, hosted Catholic nobles passing through the region, and generally conducted herself as the great lady she was. But Temple Newsam also became, in the eyes of Elizabeth's government, a centre for Catholic intrigue. Margaret made no secret of her religious faith, continuing to hear Mass in her private chapel, despite the fact that Catholicism was now illegal in England. Elizabeth's religious settlement of 1559 had restored Protestantism as the official faith and required attendance at Protestant services in parish churches, and made it treason to celebrate or attend Catholic Mass. But enforcement of these laws was uneven, particularly in the north of England, where Catholicism remained strong and where local officials were often sympathetic to the old faith or reluctant to persecute their Catholic neighbours. The exemption for private chapels in noble households, which had allowed Margaret to maintain Catholic worship during Edward VI's Protestant reign, technically no longer applied under Elizabeth's stricter religious laws. But Margaret, conscious of her royal status and of the diplomatic complications that might arise if she were persecuted too openly, continued to maintain Catholic worship at Temple Newsam and dared the government to stop her. She employed priests who said Mass, heard confessions, and provided the sacraments. She corresponded with other Catholic families throughout England and with Catholic powers on the continent. She maintained her faith openly, deliberately, and defiantly. Elizabeth's government knew about these activities. Spies had infiltrated Margaret's household, reporting regularly on who visited, what was discussed in private conversations, what letters were sent and received, and what religious practices were observed. One of these spies was William Forbes, a servant in Margaret's household, who provided detailed information to William Cecil, Elizabeth's chief minister. According to Forbes's deposition, given in May 1562, Margaret openly declared that Elizabeth was a bastard and that God would send Margaret her right to the throne one day. He reported that Margaret allowed her fool, the household jester, whose role included being permitted to say things that others could not, to rail against Queen Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, calling them traitors and claiming that Dudley had murdered his wife. Forbes also reported that Margaret refused to attend Protestant services in the parish church as required by law, that she heard Catholic Mass regularly in her private chapel, and that she corresponded with Mary Queen of Scots and with Catholic sympathisers both in England and abroad. All of this was technically treasonous, and Margaret could have been arrested and prosecuted for any of these activities. But Elizabeth hesitated to move against her, perhaps because prosecuting a member of the royal family would create diplomatic problems with Scotland, and perhaps because Elizabeth herself had some residual family feeling despite their political differences, or perhaps simply because Margaret was useful as a known quantity, whose activities could be monitored rather than driven underground, where they might become more dangerous. Margaret's great project during these years was not merely to maintain her Catholic faith or to complain about Elizabeth's illegitimacy, but to engineer a marriage between her son Darnley and Mary Queen of Scots. This plan had been forming in Margaret's mind for years, probably since Mary's return to Scotland as a widow in 1561. The logic was compelling. Mary needed a husband to provide an heir and to strengthen her position in a Scotland torn by religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Darnley was a Catholic, or at least could present himself as one, making him acceptable to Mary and to Catholic powers who supported her. He had royal blood through both his parents, giving any children he might father with Mary impeccable claims to both the Scottish and English thrones. And he was tall, handsome, accomplished and young, only 3 years younger than Mary, making him an attractive prospect on a personal level. From Margaret's perspective, the match was perfect. If Darnley married Mary, their children would unite the Stuart claims to both crowns. They would be indisputably legitimate in Catholic eyes and would have a compelling claim to succeed the childless Elizabeth on the English throne. The children of such a marriage would be not just kings or queens of Scotland, but potential rulers of a united Britain, fulfilling the dreams of union that had eluded generations of English and Scottish monarchs. And Margaret herself would be the mother and grandmother of these potential monarchs, the woman whose ambitions and determination had made it all possible. But achieving this marriage would require overcoming substantial obstacles. First, Elizabeth would never approve the match. She already feared Mary's claim to the English throne, and she certainly would not approve a marriage that would strengthen that claim by uniting two branches of the Tudor family. Second, Mary herself would need to be convinced that Darnley was the right choice among the various suitors who were being proposed for her. Third, the marriage would need to happen quickly once it was set in motion, before Elizabeth could prevent it. And fourth, Darnley would need to get to Scotland, which required travel permission from Elizabeth that would be difficult to obtain if she suspected the true purpose of the journey. Margaret began laying the groundwork for her plan years before it came to fruition. She and Lennox maintained correspondence with various factions in Scotland, carefully building relationships and offering support to those who might favour a Darnley marriage. They cultivated relationships with English nobles and officials who might support their cause, or at least not actively oppose it. And most importantly, they prepared Darnley himself for the role he would need to play, ensuring that he understood the opportunity that might be available and that he was ready to seize it when the moment came. In France, a Mary Queen of Scots had been living as Queen Consort of France through her marriage to King Francis II. She had been Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old, when her father, King James V, died in December 1542. But she had been sent to France as a child and raised at the French court, under the supervision of her Guise relatives. She married Francis in 1558, and when his father, King Henry II, died in 1559, Francis and Mary became King and Queen of France. But this triumph was brief. Francis was sickly and died in December 1560, leaving Mary a widow at age 18. Mary faced a choice: remain in France as a dowager queen with little power or influence, or return to Scotland to rule her kingdom directly. She chose to return to Scotland, and arriving in August 1561, after an absence of 13 years, the Scotland she returned to was vastly different from the one she had left as a child. The Protestant Reformation had swept through the country, overthrowing the old Catholic establishment and creating a Presbyterian church structure that was hostile to royal authority and deeply suspicious of Catholic monarchs. The Scottish nobility was divided into factions that competed for power and influence, and Mary herself, raised in the sophisticated French court and deeply committed to her Catholic faith, found herself ruling a country that was increasingly foreign to her. As a widow of 18, Mary needed a husband both to provide an heir and to strengthen her political position. Various suitors were proposed, each backed by different factions with different interests. Don Carlos of Spain, the son of King Philip II, was proposed as a match that would ally Scotland with the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe. Archduke Charles of Austria was suggested as an alternative that would provide a powerful alliance without subordinating Scotland entirely to Spanish interests. Various Scottish nobles, including the Earl of Arran, put themselves forward as potential husbands who would keep Scotland independent and under local control. Margaret Douglas, watching these developments closely from Temple Newsam, saw her opportunity. She had already sent her 13-year-old son, Darnley, to France in 1559, shortly after King Francis II's accession, with a letter of congratulation and condolence on the death of Francis's father, Henry II. This visit allowed Mary to meet Darnley for the first time, though he was still a child and made little impression on her then. But it established a connection, planted the idea of a potential marriage, and showed that the Lennox family was thinking about Mary as a possible match for their son. Margaret began writing to Mary more regularly, carefully cultivating a relationship and gradually suggesting that Darnley might make an excellent husband. She emphasized his royal blood, his accomplishments, his personal qualities, and the political advantages of a match that would unite their claims to the English throne. She presented herself as a concerned aunt. Mary and Margaret were related through Margaret Tudor, though the exact relationship was complicated, offering guidance and support to a young queen navigating difficult political waters. The scheme required patience and careful timing, and Margaret had to wait for the right moment when Mary would be receptive, when other marriage negotiations had failed or stalled, and when circumstances would allow Darnley to travel to Scotland without arousing Elizabeth's immediate suspicion. She also had to manage her own financial situation, as mounting such a campaign required money for gifts, for maintaining correspondence, for entertaining supporters, and for all the other expenses that came with dynastic scheming. She and Lennox were not wealthy by the standards of great nobles. Much of Lennox's wealth was tied up in his forfeited Scottish estates, and Margaret sometimes struggled to maintain the lifestyle and the political activities she considered necessary. By 1564, Margaret judged that the time was right to make her move. Mary's various marriage negotiations had stalled or failed. The Scottish political situation was unstable, with Protestant and Catholic factions manoeuvring for advantage, and most importantly, Elizabeth was being pressured by Parliament to name a successor, but was refusing to do so, creating uncertainty about the future that made various parties more willing to consider unconventional solutions. Lennox petitioned Elizabeth for permission to return to Scotland to reclaim his forfeited estates, presenting himself as a loyal subject who wished only to recover his family property and who might serve English interests in the Scottish court. Elizabeth, after some hesitation, granted permission, as she may have seen an opportunity to place someone with English sympathies in the Scottish court, where he could provide information and perhaps influence Mary's decisions. She may have been trying to destabilize the Scottish government by reintroducing the old Lennox-Hamilton rivalry that had plagued Scotland for decades, or she may simply not have foreseen how quickly events would move once Lennox was in Scotland. Whatever her reasoning, she allowed Lennox to travel north in late 1564, and he set about carefully preparing the ground for his son's arrival. Then, in February 1565, Darnley was granted permission to travel to Scotland as well, ostensibly to visit his father and to assist with legal matters related to the recovery of the Lennox estates. Elizabeth granted this permission, perhaps believing that a short visit by a young man to see his father was harmless, perhaps thinking that she could control the situation from a distance, or perhaps simply underestimating Margaret's determination and Mary's susceptibility to Darnley's charms. Whatever the reason, she made a crucial mistake, and Darnley headed north with his mother's careful instructions ringing in his ears, and with all her hopes riding on his ability to win Mary's heart. Darnley arrived in Scotland in February 1565, ostensibly to visit his father and assist with family business, but actually on a mission to win the heart and hand of Mary, Queen of Scots. He was 19 years old, tall and handsome, accomplished in all the courtly arts his mother had ensured he mastered, and burning with ambition to become a king. He carried with him his mother's careful instructions, her warnings about how to behave, her advice on how to charm Mary, and her absolute determination that he must succeed in this endeavour, no matter what it took. Mary, Queen of Scots, was then 22 years old, having returned to Scotland from France as a widow 4 years earlier. She was one of the most eligible women in Europe, a queen in her own right, ruling a kingdom that, though small and troubled, was strategically important in the great power politics of the age. She was beautiful, accomplished, intelligent, and deeply Catholic, though ruling over an increasingly Protestant realm. She had been proposed to by various princes and nobles, but none of the matches had worked out for various political reasons. She was lonely, under constant pressure from her Protestant lords who distrusted her religion and her French upbringing, and perhaps ready for someone who could offer companionship as well as political alliance. When Darnley was first presented to Mary at Wemyss Castle in Fife, where she was staying during a progress through her realm, he made an immediate impression. He was exceptionally tall, well over 6 feet, which was rare and striking in an age when most men were considerably shorter. He towered over Mary, who was herself quite tall for a woman of her time, and this physical presence was immediately appealing to a queen who needed a husband who looked and acted like a king. He was handsome, with the red gold hair inherited from his Tudor ancestry, fine features, and an elegant bearing that suggested royal breeding. He was fashionably dressed in the latest court styles, demonstrating both good taste and sufficient wealth to maintain a princely appearance. More importantly, Darnley knew how to charm. He had been trained from childhood in the arts of courtship and conversation. He could dance beautifully, and dancing was one of Mary's great pleasures. He could play the lute and sing, and Mary loved music and frequently held musical evenings at Holyrood Palace. He could speak French fluently, which meant he could converse with Mary in her preferred language, the language of her childhood and youth in France, rather than struggling in Scots, which she spoke less comfortably, despite it being the language of her kingdom. He could discuss literature, poetry, and the arts, all subjects that interested Mary far more than the constant religious and political conflicts that dominated her daily existence as queen. And crucially, Darnley was a Catholic, or presented himself as one, in a Scotland where Mary's own religion isolated her from many of her subjects and made her suspect in the eyes of Protestant lords who dominated the government. Darnley represented a potential ally who shared her faith and could help her resist Protestant pressure. He attended Mass with her, demonstrated familiarity with Catholic devotional practices, and generally positioned himself as a defender of the faith. Whether his Catholicism was sincere or merely convenient is debatable. He later showed himself willing to switch sides for political advantage, but in the spring of 1565, he appeared to be everything Mary might want in a husband. Within weeks of their first meeting, Mary was clearly attracted to Darnley. She invited him to stay at court rather than going to his father's estates, as he had ostensibly come to do. She included him in her hunts, her entertainments, and her daily activities. She gave him gifts, fine clothes, horses, jewels, and other tokens of favour. She created him Earl of Ross in May 1565, giving him a Scottish title in his own right. rather than just the English titles he held through his father, and she began to seriously consider him as a potential husband, discussing the match with her advisors and weighing the political advantages and disadvantages. The match had several things to recommend it from Mary's perspective. Darnley's royal blood meant that their children would have impeccable claims to both the Scottish and English thrones, potentially uniting the kingdoms in the next generation. His youth and apparent health suggested he could father many children, securing the succession that was Mary's primary duty as queen. His Catholicism meant he would support her religious preferences rather than undermining them as a Protestant husband might, and his personal charm and attractiveness meant that the marriage would not be merely a political arrangement, but potentially a love match that would provide companionship and affection. But there were also significant disadvantages that Mary's more cautious advisors pointed out. Darnley had no independent power base in Scotland and brought no useful foreign alliance. His English connections might make him more loyal to English interests than to Scottish ones. His personality, which some of Mary's advisors had already begun to perceive as vain and immature, might cause problems. And most importantly, Elizabeth I would be furious at a match that united two branches of the Tudor-Stuart family and strengthened the claim to the English throne of a Catholic alternative to Elizabeth's Protestant rule. This last point was crucial. Mary already had a claim to the English throne through her grandmother Margaret Tudor. Many Catholics, both in England and abroad, considered her the legitimate Queen of England rather than Elizabeth, whom they viewed as a bastard with no right to the throne. If Mary married Darnley and produced children, those children would have claims to England that would be almost impossible to dispute. They would be descended from both Margaret Tudor and her brother Henry VIII, combining the two branches of the Tudor family. They would be unquestionably legitimate, and they would represent a Catholic alternative that might rally support from discontented English Catholics and from Catholic powers on the continent. Elizabeth's response to the growing romance was swift and furious. She summoned Margaret Douglas to London in March 1565, ostensibly for consultations, but actually to prevent her from coordinating with her son and husband in Scotland. Margaret obeyed the summons, probably hoping that she could placate Elizabeth, or at least delay any action against Darnley long enough for him to secure Mary's commitment. But Elizabeth was not fooled by Margaret's protestations of innocence. She knew that Margaret had orchestrated the whole affair, that Darnley's presence in Scotland and his courtship of Mary were part of a carefully planned campaign to achieve what Margaret had been working toward for years. In early April 1565, as reports from Scotland made it clear that Mary was seriously considering marrying Darnley, Elizabeth ordered Margaret arrested and confined to the house of Lord and Lady Sackville in Sheen. This was not imprisonment in the Tower, not the kind of harsh confinement that might threaten Margaret's life, but it was definitely custody designed to prevent her from acting or communicating freely. Margaret was held under house arrest, her correspondence monitored, her visitors restricted, and her ability to influence events in Scotland eliminated. Elizabeth also sent urgent messages to Scotland demanding that Mary abandon any thought of marrying Darnley and ordering Darnley to return to England immediately. She declared that the marriage would be considered treasonous, that anyone who participated in or supported it would be acting against the Crown of England, and that there would be severe consequences if Mary proceeded. She wrote to Mary in the strongest terms, reminding her of their kinship, warning her that this match would destroy any possibility of friendship between their kingdoms, and threatening vague but ominous consequences. But Mary, whether driven by genuine love for Darnley, by political calculation about the advantages of the match, by stubbornness in the face of Elizabeth's threats, or by some combination of all these factors, refused to back down. She had made up her mind, and she proceeded with the marriage despite all warnings. On July the 29th, 1565, Mary and Darnley were married at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. The ceremony was conducted according to Catholic rites, which was itself provocative to Protestant Scotland. Mary made Darnley King of Scots, giving him not just the title of consort, but actual kingly authority, a decision she would soon have cause to regret. The marriage was initially happy, or at least appeared so. Mary was clearly in love with her handsome young husband, and Darnley played the role of devoted consort reasonably well for the first few weeks. They hunted together, danced together, and generally presented themselves as a united couple ruling Scotland together. Mum Mary became pregnant within weeks of the marriage, fulfilling her primary duty and raising hopes that the succession would soon be secured. For a brief moment, it seemed that Margaret's grand scheme might actually succeed, that her son would be a king, and that the children of his marriage would unite the British crowns. But back in England, Margaret remained a prisoner, held under increasingly harsh conditions as Elizabeth's fury at the unauthorized marriage grew. In September 1565, Margaret was transferred from house arrest at Syon to actual imprisonment in the Tower of London. She was lodged in the apartments where she had been imprisoned nearly 30 years earlier after her engagement to Thomas Howard, forced to relive that earlier trauma as she contemplated the consequences of her latest defiance of royal authority. The Tower in 1565 was the same fortress it had been in 1536, the same place of confinement and death that had haunted Margaret's youth. She was imprisoned there at age 50, no longer the young woman of 20 who had believed love could conquer all but a mature woman, who had gambled everything on her son's success, and who now faced the consequences of that gamble. She had comfortable apartments, rather than a dungeon cell. Her royal blood still provided some protection, but she was nonetheless a prisoner facing uncertain prospects and possible execution for treason. And the charges against Margaret were essentially the same as those that had been brought against her in 1536, facilitating an unauthorized royal marriage in violation of the Act of Succession, and acting to advance claims to the English throne without royal permission. The fact that this time the marriage was in Scotland rather than England, and that it involved Mary Queen of Scots rather than Margaret herself, made the legal situation more complicated, but did not fundamentally change the nature of the offence. Margaret had conspired to unite two branches of the Tudor-Stuart family in a way that directly threatened Elizabeth's position and security. In the Tower, Margaret had time to contemplate what she had achieved and what it had cost her. She had successfully married her son to a reigning queen, and making him a king and positioning his future children to inherit multiple crowns. But she was imprisoned, possibly facing execution, and completely cut off from her son and unable to advise or guide him as he navigated the treacherous waters of Scottish politics. Lennox, too, was in a difficult position in Scotland, trying to support his son while managing the complex factional politics of Mary's court and dealing with the hostility of Protestant lords who resented Darnley's Catholicism and his sudden elevation to kingship. Margaret would remain imprisoned for nearly 2 years, from September 1565 until October 1567. During that time, she would witness from a distance some of the most dramatic and tragic events in Scottish history, events that would destroy her son, threaten her daughter-in-law Mary Queen of Scots, but also produce her grandson, the child who would eventually unite the British crowns and fulfill Margaret's dreams, though in ways she could never have anticipated, and at costs she could never have imagined paying. While Margaret sat imprisoned in the Tower of London, events in Scotland spiralled rapidly out of control in ways that would have horrified her had she known the details, the marriage between Mary and Darnley, which had begun with such hope and which Margaret had worked so hard to achieve, deteriorated with shocking speed. Within months of the wedding, it became clear that Darnley was not the prince that Mary had thought she was marrying, and that Margaret had raised him to be. Instead, he was revealed as vain, arrogant, violent, unreliable, a man fundamentally incapable of the political judgment and self-control necessary to be an effective king. The problems began almost immediately after the marriage. Darnley had been given the title King of Scots and expected to exercise real power alongside Mary as her co-ruler. But Mary, who had been ruling Scotland on her own for 4 years, and who was an intelligent and capable monarch despite her youth, had no intention of surrendering actual authority to her husband. She consulted him on some matters as a courtesy, but she made the important decisions herself, working with her Privy Council and her chief advisers to govern the kingdom. The title, King of Scots, that she had given Darnley was largely honorific, meant to satisfy his pride and give him status, but not intended to transfer real power. Darnley, however, expected to rule. He had been raised by Margaret to believe himself destined for kingship, trained to give orders and expect obedience, and conditioned to think of himself as superior by virtue of his royal blood. The reality that Mary kept him at arm's length from actual governance, that her advisers did not treat him as their master, and that he was essentially a consort with a fancy title rather than a ruling king, infuriated him. He began to drink heavily, spending his days and nights in taverns and alehouses in Edinburgh, carousing with unsavoury companions and making a spectacle of himself in ways that embarrassed Mary and damaged the prestige of the crown. He also began to resent Mary's relationship with David Rizzio, her Italian secretary. And Rizzio was a talented musician and courtier who had entered Mary's service in 1561 as a bass singer in her private chapel. He had risen to become her private secretary for French correspondence, a position that gave him considerable access to the Queen and influence over her decisions. Rizzio was intelligent, cultured, and discreet, everything that Darnley was not, and Mary trusted him and enjoyed his company. The two would spend hours together working on correspondence, discussing diplomatic matters, and enjoying musical entertainments. Darnley, in his drunken jealousy, convinced himself that Mary and Rizzio were having an affair, that the Italian secretary was the real father of the child Mary was carrying, and that he himself was being cuckolded and humiliated. There was almost certainly no truth to these suspicions. Rizzio was probably homosexual, given various contemporary comments about his preferences and behavior. Mary was devoutly Catholic and took her marriage vows seriously, despite her growing disillusionment with her husband, and the child she was carrying would be born with the distinctive Stewart features that marked him clearly as Darnley's son. But Darnley's paranoia, fed by alcohol and by factional lords who saw an opportunity to use the king's jealousy for their own political purposes, grew into murderous rage. Protestant lords who resented Mary's Catholicism and her reliance on Rizzio, whom they saw as a Catholic foreigner who had too much influence over their queen, allied with Darnley in a plot to murder Rizzio. They promised Darnley that if he supported them in killing Rizzio, they would work to give him the crown matrimonial, a legal status that would make him not just king consort, but co-ruler with rights independent of Mary, that would continue even if she died. They also hinted that they would support him in taking more control over the government, pushing aside Mary's current advisors and allowing Darnley to rule more directly. What Darnley either did not understand or did not care about was that these lords were using him for their own purposes. They wanted to murder Rizzio to eliminate Catholic influence over Mary and to terrify the Queen into becoming more compliant with Protestant demands. they had no real intention of giving Darnley more power. They had already seen how incompetent and unreliable he was. They needed his participation because his position as Mary's husband would provide cover for their actions and make it harder for Mary to punish them afterward. Darnley, too drunk and too foolish to see that he was being manipulated, agreed to the plot. On the evening of March 9, 1566, Mary was dining with a small group of intimates in her private apartments at Holyrood Palace. It was a small supper. Just a few friends including Rizzio, her half-brother Lord Robert Stewart, and her half-sister the Countess of Argyll. Mary was 6 months pregnant and feeling unwell, so she had chosen to dine privately, rather than holding the usual formal dinner in the Great Hall. The group was seated around a small table in the Queen's inner chamber, a relatively intimate space that could be reached only by climbing a narrow staircase from the King's apartments below. Suddenly, Darnley appeared through a private door that connected his apartments to Mary's chambers. He joined the supper party, sitting next to Mary and behaving with apparent normalcy, though he had been drinking and was tense. Then, moments later, Lord Ruthven appeared in the doorway, dressed in armour despite being so ill that he could barely stand. Ruthven was one of the Protestant lords who had organised the conspiracy. He demanded that Rizzio come with him, claiming the secretary had offended the crown and must face justice. Mary, immediately sensing danger, ordered Ruthven to leave. She stood between Ruthven and Rizzio, using her body and her authority as queen to protect her servant. But Ruthven was not deterred. He pushed forward, and other conspirators began to flood into the small chamber through both the private door and the main entrance. There was shouting, struggle, and chaos as Mary tried to defend Rizzio, and the conspirators tried to seize him. Someone knocked over the table, plunging the room into near darkness as the candles were scattered. Someone held a pistol to Mary's pregnant belly, threatening to shoot if she did not stand aside. Rizzio screamed for mercy in Italian and French, begging Mary to save him, crying out that he was being murdered. He clung to Mary's skirts, hiding behind her, believing that the conspirators would not dare to kill him in the Queen's presence. But they dragged him from the room, through the outer chamber, and out into the gallery. There, they stabbed him to death with dozens of dagger wounds. Some accounts say over 50 stab wounds were found on his body. They left his corpse lying in a pool of blood at the top of the main staircase, a warning to anyone who might think of serving the Catholic Queen against the interests of the Protestant lords. Mary, traumatized by witnessing this brutal murder, was initially held prisoner in her own apartments. The conspirators surrounded the palace with their armed men, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. They planned to keep Mary confined until she agreed to their demands, which included pardoning the murderers, giving Darnley the crown matrimonial, and changing her religious and political policies to favour Protestant interests. For a pregnant woman who had just witnessed a close friend murdered in her presence, who was being threatened and constrained by armed men, the situation was terrifying beyond words. But Mary, despite her youth and her pregnancy, proved to be made of stern stuff. Within 24 hours, she had turned the situation to her advantage by exploiting the one weakness in the conspirators' plans, Darnley himself. She appealed to her husband, reminding him that he had been used by the conspirators, that they had no intention of giving him real power, and that if anything happened to her or to their unborn child, he would be blamed and likely executed. She promised that if he helped her escape, she would forgive his involvement in Rizzio's murder and restore him to favour. Darnley, realising that he had been manipulated and that the conspiracy was likely to end with his own destruction as much as Mary's, agreed to help his wife. Late at night on March 11th, just 2 days after the murder, Mary and Darnley escaped from Holyrood Palace. Despite being 6 months pregnant and still traumatized, Mary rode 25 miles overnight to Dunbar Castle, where loyal forces could protect her. From this position of safety, she rallied her supporters, gathered an army, and within days had retaken Edinburgh and forced the conspirators to flee. The murder of Rizzio was a turning point in Mary's reign and in her marriage to Darnley. She had lost a trusted advisor and friend in circumstances of terrible violence. She had been threatened while pregnant, traumatized in ways that would haunt her for the rest of her life, and she had learned definitively that her husband was weak, unreliable, and unwilling to participate in conspiracies against her own life and safety. Whatever love she had felt for Darnley died in the aftermath of Rizzio's murder. She treated him with cold courtesy rather than affection, kept him at a distance, and made clear that she no longer trusted him. Darnley, for his part, tried to deny his involvement in the murder. He claimed he had been forced to participate, that the conspirators had threatened him, that he had never intended for things to go so far. He begged Mary's forgiveness and promised reformed behavior. But Mary knew the truth, and so did everyone else at court. Darnley had been an active participant in the conspiracy. His presence in Mary's chamber at the crucial moment had enabled the murderers to enter, and his betrayal of his wife was complete. The marriage, barely 8 months old, was effectively over, though Mary could not divorce Darnley without endangering the legitimacy of their unborn child. On June 19th, 1566, Mary gave birth to a son at Edinburgh Castle. The child was healthy and strong, and his birth secured the succession to the Scottish throne. Mary named him James, after his grandfather King James V, and in accordance with the tradition of the Scottish royal house. The baptism was conducted with great ceremony, according to Catholic rites, with representatives from England, France, and Savoy standing as godparents and bringing magnificent gifts. It was the proudest moment of Mary's reign, the achievement of her primary duty as queen, and the creation of the heir who would eventually unite the British crowns. But even in this moment of triumph, and the breakdown of Mary's marriage was painfully evident. Darnley refused to attend his son's baptism, claiming illness, but actually sulking because Mary would not give him the crown matrimonial, and because he knew that everyone at court despised him for his behavior. He spent the celebrations drunk and miserable, complaining about perceived slights and threatening to leave Scotland entirely. Mary ignored him, focused on her son, and on the political work of securing support from foreign powers who might recognize James as not just heir to Scotland, but potential heir to England as well. By the autumn of 1566, Mary was clearly looking for a way to be rid of Darnley. Divorce was problematic because it might call into question young James's legitimacy. Unannulment on grounds that the marriage had never been valid was possible, but would definitely make James illegitimate and was therefore unacceptable. That left only Darnley's death, either through natural causes or through violence, as a way to free Mary from a marriage that had become intolerable. Whether Mary actually conspired in her husband's murder, or whether she was merely aware that others were planning it and did nothing to prevent it, remains one of the great historical controversies. What is certain is that by early 1567, a conspiracy was forming among Scottish lords to murder Darnley. The conspiracy included James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who had become Mary's chief advisor and possibly her lover. It included various other Protestant lords who hated Darnley for his arrogance and his incompetence, and it may have included Mary herself, though the evidence is ambiguous and has been debated by historians for 4.5 centuries. In late January 1567, Darnley fell ill, probably with syphilis, though contemporary accounts describe it as smallpox. He was isolated in Glasgow, away from the court, nursing his illness and complaining about his treatment. Mary, showing an apparent softening toward her husband, travelled to Glasgow in late January to visit him. She was kind and attentive, promising that their marriage could be repaired, that she would forgive him for the Rizzio affair, that he could return to Edinburgh and to court. She persuaded him to come back to Edinburgh to continue his convalescence in better surroundings, but instead of bringing Darnley to the palace, Mary installed him in a house at Kirkhofield, on the outskirts of Edinburgh. The house was isolated, surrounded by open ground, and far from the protection of the palace guard. Mary visited Darnley there several times, spending hours with him, even sleeping in a room below his chamber on at least one occasion. She was creating an alibi, making it clear that she had been reconciling with her husband, that she had been attentive and caring, and that she had no apparent reason to harm him. On the night of February 9th to 10th, 1567, Mary attended a wedding celebration at Holyrood Palace. She had planned to spend the night at Kirkhofield with Darnley, but at the last minute changed her mind, claiming she needed to return to the palace for some official business or social obligation. She left Kirkhofield around 11 o'clock at night, taking all her servants with her and leaving Darnley with only a page boy for company. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on February 10th, a massive explosion destroyed the house at Kirkhofield. The blast was so powerful that it woke people across Edinburgh, shattered windows throughout the city, and left nothing but rubble where the house had stood. When rescuers arrived at first light, they found Darnley's body in the garden, some distance from the ruins of the house. He was dressed only in his nightshirt, and he showed no signs of burns or injuries from the explosion. Instead, he appeared to have been strangled or smothered. Near his body lay his page boy, also dead, also apparently strangled rather than killed in the blast, and the physical evidence suggested that Darnley had somehow escaped or been removed from the house before the explosion, had been murdered elsewhere in the garden, and had then been left where he would be found. But why had the house been blown up if Darnley was already dead? The most likely explanation is that the conspirators had placed gunpowder in the house intending to kill Darnley in an explosion that would look like an accident, perhaps suggesting that Darnley himself had been storing gunpowder and had accidentally ignited it. But Darnley had somehow discovered the plot, had tried to flee through a window, and had been caught and murdered in the garden by conspirators who were guarding the house to prevent escape. The murder of the King of Scots was an enormous scandal that reverberated throughout Europe. Here was a reigning monarch who had been murdered in circumstances that strongly suggested a conspiracy involving high-ranking nobles and possibly the Queen herself. Protestant lords in Scotland used the murder as evidence that Mary was a wicked woman, possibly an adulteress, and certainly unfit to rule. Catholic powers on the continent were shocked and disturbed that such a thing could happen to a Catholic king, and Elizabeth I, receiving the news in England, was both horrified at the crime and grimly satisfied that her warnings about Mary's reckless marriage to Darnley had been vindicated. Suspicion immediately fell on the Earl of Bothwell, who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to organize such a murder. And Bothwell was tried and acquitted in a legal proceeding that convinced no one of his innocence. He had packed the courtroom with armed supporters who made it clear that a guilty verdict would result in violence. Then, in an act that shocked even by the standards of 16th century politics, Bothwell abducted Mary, probably raped her to force a marriage, and then married her on May 15th, 1567, just 3 months after Darnley's murder. This marriage destroyed what remained of Mary's political credibility. Protestant lords rebelled, raising an army to rescue their queen from Bothwell's control and to punish both Bothwell and Mary for Darnley's murder. Mary and Bothwell raised their own army, but their forces were defeated at Carberry Hill on June 15, 1567. Bothwell escaped and fled to Scandinavia, where he was eventually imprisoned and died insane. Mary was taken prisoner by the rebel lords, imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle, and forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James on July the 24th, 1567. The one-year-old James VI was crowned King of Scots on July 29th, 1567, at Stirling. A regent was needed to govern during his minority, and the Scottish lords chose Matthew Stewart, Earl of Lennox, Darnley's father, and Margaret Douglas's husband, for this crucial role. Margaret Douglas, still imprisoned in the Tower of London through all these dramatic events in Scotland, learned of her son's death sometime in mid-February 1567. The news would have been brought to her by a royal messenger or by one of her guards, probably with little ceremony and minimal details. She was simply told that Lord Darnley, her son, the King of Scots, had been murdered in Edinburgh under circumstances that were suspicious and scandalous, that his body had been found in the garden of a house that had been destroyed by a massive explosion, and that the entire affair had created a crisis in Scotland. We have no record of Margaret's immediate reaction to this news. There is no letter preserving her first expressions of grief, no diary entry recording her thoughts, no account by witnesses describing her behaviour. The historical record is silent on what must have been one of the most painful moments of an already painful life. We can only imagine the shock, the grief, the horror, and the complicated mixture of emotions that must have overwhelmed her. Margaret had invested everything in her son. She had raised him from birth with the specific goal of making him a king. She had spent enormous sums on his education and training. She had endured imprisonment, alienation from the court, financial hardship, and years of patient scheming to engineer his marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots. She had seen him achieve what she had worked for, become King of Scots, marry a reigning queen, father a son who was heir to multiple crowns, and now he was dead, murdered at age 21, less than 2 years after his triumphant marriage, with his career barely begun and his promise unfulfilled. But Margaret's grief must have been complicated by other emotions as well. She had heard reports from Scotland about Darnley's behaviour, his drinking, his arrogance, his involvement in the Rizzio murder, his estrangement from Mary. She must have known that her son had squandered the opportunities she had created for him, that he had proven unequal to the role she had prepared him to play, and that his own character flaws had contributed to his destruction. There must have been guilt mixed with her grief, the agonizing question of whether she had somehow failed as a mother, whether she had raised him incorrectly, whether she had instilled in him the arrogance and the sense of entitlement that had made him unable to navigate the political complexities of the Scottish court. And there must have been anger as well. Anger at whoever had murdered her son. Anger at Mary, Queen of Scots, whom she suspected of complicity in the crime. Anger at the Scottish lords who had turned against Darnley. Anger at Elizabeth I, who had imprisoned her and prevented her from being with her son in his last months. Anger at the world for destroying what she had worked so hard to build. Margaret wasn't released from the Tower immediately after Darnley's death. Elizabeth kept her imprisoned through the spring and summer of 1567, as events in Scotland continued to unfold with shocking rapidity. Margaret learned of Mary's scandalous marriage to Bothwell, of the rebellion against Mary, of Mary's imprisonment and forced abdication, and of the coronation of her grandson James as King of Scots. Each piece of news must have brought fresh waves of emotion, relief that her grandson was now king, concern for his safety in the hands of the rebel lords, grief for what had been lost, and determination to somehow salvage something from the wreckage of her plans. In October 1567, nearly 2 years after her imprisonment had begun, and 8 months after her son's death, Margaret was finally released from the Tower. Elizabeth had decided that continued imprisonment served no useful purpose. Margaret was no longer a threat. Her schemes had collapsed, her son was dead, and her daughter-in-law Mary was herself a prisoner in Scotland with no prospect of regaining her throne. Elizabeth could afford to show mercy, and releasing Margaret was a gesture that cost little and might even win some gratitude. Margaret returned to Temple Newsam, to the house where she had raised her sons and where she had plotted to make Darnley a king. She was 52 years old, had been imprisoned twice for a total of more than 3 years, had lost her first love to imprisonment and death, had lost numerous children in infancy, and had now lost her eldest son and heir in scandalous circumstances that implicated him in conspiracy and possibly adultery. She had achieved her goal of seeing her son crowned as king, but the victory had been brief, and the cost had been terrible. And she still had work to do, because her grandson James was now King of Scots, and his future would depend on the decisions made by the regent who governed in his name. That regent was her husband, Matthew Stewart, Earl of Lennox. In September 1567, while Margaret was still imprisoned, the Scottish Parliament had chosen Lennox to serve as regent for the young King James VI, and this was partly because of his royal blood and his relationship to the child king. He was, after all, James's paternal grandfather. But it was also because the Protestant lords who now controlled Scotland saw Lennox as someone they could work with. He had spent years in England, he was associated with English interests, and he was known to be willing to cooperate with Protestant factions despite his nominal Catholicism. Lennox accepted the regency and travelled to Scotland to take up his duties. This meant that Margaret and her husband were separated for what would prove to be the last years of his life. Lennox remained in Scotland, governing on behalf of his infant grandson and dealing with the constant political crises that plagued the kingdom. Margaret remained in England at Temple Newsam and sometimes in London, and managing the family's English estates and interests. They corresponded regularly, but they rarely saw each other, and the burden of governing Scotland in the midst of civil war and religious conflict took a heavy toll on Lennox's health and spirits. Being regent of Scotland in the late 1560s was an impossible job. The country was divided between supporters of the young King James and supporters of his mother Mary, who had escaped from Loch Castle in May 1568 and had tried unsuccessfully to regain her throne before fleeing to England, where she became Elizabeth's prisoner. The supporters of Queen Mary, the Queen's Party as they were called, controlled several important castles including Edinburgh Castle, and they refused to recognise James as legitimate king or Lennox as legitimate regent, and there was constant fighting, with raids and counter-raids, sieges of castles, and occasional pitched battles. Lennox also had to deal with the complicated question of punishing those responsible for his son's murder. He wanted justice for Darnley, wanted to see the Earl of Bothwell and all the other conspirators arrested and executed. But Bothwell was in Denmark, imprisoned by King Frederick II, and slowly going mad in terrible conditions, but beyond Lennox's reach. And many of the other conspirators were powerful lords who had been part of the faction that put Lennox in power. Pursuing them too aggressively would alienate his supporters and might cost him his position or even his life. Margaret, watching from England, provided advice and support to her husband through letters. She urged him to be cautious, to build alliances carefully, and to avoid antagonizing powerful factions unnecessarily. She also worked to maintain the family's position in England, corresponding with Queen Elizabeth's ministers and seeking to ensure that English support for the King's party in Scotland continued. She presented herself as a loyal subject who had been punished enough for her son's unauthorized marriage and who now wanted only to support her grandson's legitimate rights. On September 4th, 1571, disaster struck. Lennox was in Stirling, presiding over a meeting of the Scottish Parliament, when a group of Queen Mary's supporters raided the town. There was fighting in the streets as Lennox's guards tried to repel the attackers. Lennox himself was wounded, shot in the back as he tried to escape the fighting. He was carried from Stirling to Edinburgh, lingering for a few days in great pain, before dying on September 4th, 1571, at age 55. Margaret received the news of her husband's death in early September. She had now lost her eldest son and her husband within 4.5 years. She was 56 years old, a widow with one surviving son, Charles Stewart, who was about 14 years old at the time. She had property and income from the estates that Henry VIII had granted her and Lennox at the time of their marriage, but she was not wealthy by the standards of great nobles. Much of Lennox's property in Scotland was still not restored to the family, or was caught up in the ongoing civil war, and Margaret faced an uncertain future, with no husband to support her and no clear role in the new political order. But Margaret wasn't one to simply retire from public life and spend her remaining years in quiet obscurity. She still had ambitions, still had schemes, and still had work to do. Her grandson James VI was King of Scots. Her daughter-in-law, Mary Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's prisoner in England, and the question of who would succeed the childless Elizabeth to the English throne remained unsettled. Margaret intended to ensure that her grandson would inherit both crowns, would succeed where his father had failed, and would fulfill the dreams that had driven her entire adult life. After Lennox's death in September 1571, Margaret withdrew to Temple Newsam and to her houses in London. She was now a widow of 56, having lost her husband, her eldest son, numerous infant children, and any illusions she might have had about the easiness of achieving dynastic ambitions. But she was also the grandmother of a reigning king, James VI of Scotland, and she remained convinced that her grandson would eventually unite the British crowns and that her line would triumph in the end. Margaret's younger son, Charles Stuart, was now her focus and her hope for continuing the family line. Charles had been born in 1557, making him about 14 years old when his father died. He had been raised largely in England, educated according to the same humanist principles that had shaped his brother Darnley's education, though perhaps with more attention to developing judgment and character, given the lessons of Darnley's catastrophic failure. Charles was described as physically attractive, intelligent, and considerably more stable than his brother had been, though he lacked Darnley's striking height and presence. Margaret began planning a suitable marriage for Charles, understanding that at 14 he was still too young, but that preparations needed to begin. She considered various possibilities: daughters of English nobles who would strengthen the family's position in England, Scottish heiresses who might bring property and political connections, even continental matches that might bring foreign alliances. She corresponded with various families, sounded out possibilities, and generally worked to position Charles advantageously in the marriage market. But Margaret's attention was also drawn to Scotland, where her grandson James VI was being raised by regents and tutors chosen by the Protestant lords who had overthrown Mary Queen of Scots. James had been crowned king at 13 months old and had grown up knowing his mother only through letters and portraits, never having seen her since she fled to England when he was 1 year old. He was being raised as a Protestant, educated by George Buchanan, one of the finest scholars in Europe, but also a stern disciplinarian who believed in hard work and harsh punishment. Buchanan would beat the young king for failures in his lessons, creating an educational environment that was intellectually rigorous but emotionally cold. Margaret worried about her grandson's upbringing. She was concerned that he was not being raised with sufficient consciousness of his royal dignity and his claims to the English throne. She was troubled that his Protestant education might make him hostile to the Catholic faith that she valued so highly. She feared that the regents who governed Scotland in James's name might be more interested in serving their own factional interests than in preparing the young king for effective rule, and she desperately wanted to be involved in his life, to influence his education and development, to ensure that he understood his heritage and his destiny. But Margaret's ability to influence events in Scotland was limited. She was an Englishwoman living in England, the widow of a regent who had been murdered by Queen Mary's supporters, and therefore viewed with suspicion by many factions in Scotland. The various regents who succeeded Lennox, first the Earl of Mar and then the Earl of Morton, had no particular reason to heed Margaret's advice or to allow her significant access to the young king. They sent polite replies to her letters, but generally ignored her suggestions and excluded her from decision-making about James's upbringing and education. Margaret did maintain correspondence with her grandson as he grew older and learned to write. These letters, though mostly lost to us now, probably contained advice about kingship, reminiscences about his father and grandfather, and encouragement to remember his heritage and his claims. James, for his part, seems to have been dutiful in writing to his grandmother, though whether he took her advice seriously or simply wrote out of obligation is unclear. He would later show himself to be a shrewd and effective politician who understood when to ignore well-meaning but impractical advice. Margaret also continued to manage her own affairs, which included maintaining her estates, dealing with tenants and legal matters, and generally ensuring that she had sufficient income to live in the style appropriate to her rank. This was not easy. The English estates that Henry VIII had granted her and Lennox were substantial but not enormous. The Scottish properties that should have been part of Lennox's inheritance were still largely not restored, or were caught up in the ongoing conflicts in Scotland. Margaret sometimes struggled financially, finding it difficult to maintain multiple households, to provide appropriate hospitality, and to present the magnificent appearance that was expected of a Tudor princess. She also continued to practice her Catholic faith, though this became increasingly dangerous as Elizabeth's reign progressed and as tensions between Catholics and Protestants intensified. The 1570s saw increasing persecution of Catholics in England, with fines for recusancy, failure to attend Protestant services, laws against harbouring Catholic priests, and growing paranoia about Catholic plots following the Northern Rebellion of 1569 and the Papal Bull of 1570 that excommunicated Elizabeth and released Catholics from their duty of obedience to her. Margaret, because of her royal status, enjoyed some protection from the worst of this persecution, and Elizabeth did not want to create a martyr by prosecuting her own relative for religious nonconformity. But Margaret had to be careful. She could not practice her faith too openly without risking punishment. She had to maintain at least a minimal appearance of conformity with the established church, and she had to endure the knowledge that her religious beliefs made her suspect in the eyes of the Protestant government and might limit her ability to influence events or protect her family's interests. In 1574, Margaret faced another crisis that would result in her third and final imprisonment. Her younger son Charles, now about 17 years old, had secretly married Elizabeth Cavendish, daughter of the formidable Bess of Hardwicke, without obtaining Queen Elizabeth's permission. This was exactly the same offence that had landed Margaret in the Tower in 1536 and again in 1565, an unauthorised royal marriage in violation of the laws requiring permission for anyone with a claim to the throne. The marriage had been facilitated by Bess of Hardwicke, who was one of the wealthiest and most ambitious women in England. Bess had been married 4 times, each marriage bringing her more wealth and status. Her current husband was George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, who was serving as Mary Queen of Scots' jailer. Bess saw in Charles Stuart an opportunity to link her family to the royal blood of the Tudors and Stuarts. If Charles and Elizabeth Cavendish had children, those children would have claims to the English throne. They would be Margaret Douglas's grandchildren, a Mary Queen of Scots' nephews or nieces by marriage, and potential heirs if the various more direct lines failed. The marriage was arranged during a visit that Margaret made to the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury, probably in late 1573 or early 1574. Margaret had come to visit her daughter-in-law, Mary Queen of Scots, who was still Shrewsbury's prisoner, and whom Margaret had not seen since Mary's flight to England. The visit was officially about family matters and perhaps about reconciliation. Margaret and Mary had been enemies since Darnley's death, with each blaming the other for the catastrophe, but enough time had passed that some relationship might be rebuilt, especially since they shared an interest in young King James's welfare. During this visit, Bess of Hardwicke proposed the marriage between Charles Stewart and her daughter, Elizabeth Cavendish. The match had obvious advantages for both families. For the Stuarts, it brought a connection to the wealthy Cavendish family and potential financial support. For the Cavendishes, it brought royal blood and proximity to the throne. Margaret seems to have given her approval to the match, or at least not to have prevented it, though whether she actively encouraged it or simply failed to stop it is unclear. The marriage took place quickly and quietly, probably in November 1574, but it could not be kept secret for long. When Queen Elizabeth learned of it, she was predictably furious. Here was yet another unauthorized royal marriage, and facilitated by the same woman, Margaret Douglas, who had already been imprisoned twice for similar offences. Elizabeth ordered both Margaret and Bess of Hardwicke arrested and brought to London to answer for their actions. Margaret was taken to the Tower of London for the third time in her life, imprisoned in the same fortress where she had been held in 1536 and 1565. But this imprisonment was brief, lasting only about 9 or 10 months. Elizabeth was still angry, but the offence was less serious than previous ones. Charles Stewart had no realistic prospect of inheriting the throne, barring the deaths of numerous people ahead of him in the succession. The marriage had already taken place and could not be undone without creating a scandal. And most importantly, Margaret was now 59 years old, in declining health, and unlikely to cause further problems. Margaret was released from the Tower in October 1575, having secured a pardon through the intercession of various friends and relatives who petitioned Elizabeth on her behalf. She returned to her houses in London and Yorkshire, officially forgiven but effectively marginalised from court life and political influence. Elizabeth made clear that Margaret was not welcome at court, and that her role in public life was over. She could live quietly on her estates, practice her religion privately, and generally stay out of trouble, but she was not to involve herself in any more marriage schemes or political plots. The marriage between Charles Stewart and Elizabeth Cavendish produced one child, a daughter named Arbella Stewart, born in 1575 at Chatsworth, Bess of Hardwicke's magnificent house in Derbyshire. This granddaughter would be the last joy and the last heartbreak of Margaret's life. Arbella carried the blood of both the Tudors and the Stuarts, making her yet another potential heir to the English throne. She was beautiful, intelligent, and from birth surrounded by the expectations and pressures that came with royal blood. But tragedy struck quickly. Charles Stewart, Margaret's younger son, and Arbella's father, died in April 1576, when he was only 20 years old. The cause of death is unclear, possibly tuberculosis or another wasting disease, possibly simply the cumulative effects of poor health. His death left Arbella fatherless before her first birthday, and left Margaret bereaved yet again, having now lost both her sons before they reached 30 years of age, and Margaret took custody of her infant granddaughter, bringing Arbella to live with her at Hackney, one of Margaret's London properties, for the last 2 years of her life from 1576 to 1578. Margaret devoted herself to caring for Arbella and planning for the child's future. She hired tutors to begin Arbella's education even as a toddler. She made sure the child understood her royal heritage and her potential destiny. She probably told her stories about the Tudor and Stuart monarchs from whom she was descended, about the claims she would one day press, about the greatness that awaited her if circumstances allowed. But Margaret's health was failing. She was now in her early 60s, elderly by 16th century standards, and had endured tremendous stress and trauma throughout her life, as she had been imprisoned 3 times for a total of nearly 4 years. She had lost her first love, her husband, both her sons, most of her children in infancy, and seen her dynastic dreams repeatedly frustrated. The strain had taken its toll on her body and spirit. In early March 1578, Margaret fell seriously ill. The nature of her illness is not precisely recorded. Possibly pneumonia, possibly a stroke or heart attack, possibly simply the general failure of a body worn out by years of hardship. She was attended by physicians who could do little beyond making her comfortable. She was visited by friends and family members who came to pay their respects to a dying princess. And she was attended by Catholic priests who heard her final confession and provided the last sacraments of the Church she had remained faithful to throughout her life, despite persecution and pressure to conform. Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, died on March 9, 1578, at her house in Hackney. She was 62 years old. She died in her bed, attended by those who loved her, conscious until near the end, and having made provision in her will for the distribution of her property and the care of her granddaughter Arbella. Her death was mourned by Catholics throughout England, who saw in her one of the last great Catholic nobles from the old generation. And it was noted with satisfaction by Protestant officials who had long viewed her as a potential focus for Catholic intrigue, and who were relieved that she was finally gone. Margaret's funeral was held at Westminster Abbey, one of the great churches of England and the traditional burial place for royalty and great nobles. Queen Elizabeth, despite all their conflicts and despite the fact that Margaret had been imprisoned 3 times during Elizabeth's reign, paid for a magnificent funeral that was appropriate to Margaret's royal status. Elizabeth understood that Margaret had been a princess of the blood, the daughter of a queen and the granddaughter of a king, and that she deserved to be buried with honor, regardless of the political complications she had caused during her lifetime. The funeral was attended by a large crowd of nobles and courtiers, Catholic sympathizers, and ordinary Londoners who came to pay respects to a woman who had been a fixture of English political life for more than 50 years. Margaret's coffin was covered with black velvet and draped with her arms and royal insignia. Her chief mourners included her granddaughter Arbella Stewart, though the child was only about 2 years old and could not have understood what was happening, and various distant relatives who represented the branches of the Tudor and Stuart families. Margaret was buried in the south aisle of Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey, in a tomb that she had prepared during her lifetime. The tomb was elaborate and expensive, featuring a marble effigy of Margaret in her funeral robes, with her hands clasped in prayer and her coronet on her head to indicate her royal status. The tomb was decorated with carved panels showing various religious scenes and symbols of mourning. And most importantly, the tomb bore a Latin inscription that carefully recorded Margaret's royal lineage and claims. The inscription describes Margaret as the most illustrious and most excellent Princess Lady Margaret, Countess of Lennox, daughter of the most high and most powerful Prince, Lord Henry, King of England, France and Ireland, the 7th of that name, and of the most serene Queen Margaret. daughter of the most excellent Henry, King of England, the seventh of that name. It then lists her descendants: wife of the most noble and powerful Earl Matthew, Earl of Lennox, who, after she bore him Matthew, Earl of Lennox, by whose marriage with Mary, the most serene Queen of Scotland, the most high and most excellent Prince James, and now King of Scotland, was begotten, bore also to the said Earl another son, Charles, Earl of Lennox, from whom the Lady Arbella is descended. The inscription was carefully worded to emphasize Margaret's royal blood, her descent from two kings named Henry, and most importantly, her position as grandmother to King James VI of Scotland. It was a final assertion of the claims she had pursued throughout her life, a reminder to anyone who read it that her family was destined for greatness, that her grandson would one day unite the British crowns, and that all her suffering and scheming had been in service of a goal that would ultimately be achieved. As you drift towards sleep, dear listener, consider the extraordinary life of Margaret Douglas, and a woman who lived through some of the most dramatic events of the Tudor age, and who shaped history through her ambitions and her sorrows. She was born in a castle under siege, the daughter of a queen fleeing from a failed marriage. She was raised at the court of her uncle King Henry VIII, educated alongside princesses and trained in all the accomplishments of a Tudor lady. She fell in love with a courtier and was imprisoned in the Tower, watching helplessly as her love died of disease and despair in his cell. She married for political reasons but found affection with her husband, bearing children who mostly died in infancy, but also producing two sons who survived. She raised her eldest son to be a king, investing all her hopes and dreams in a handsome, accomplished, and arrogant young man who would briefly achieve everything she wanted before being murdered in circumstances that destroyed his reputation and broke her heart. She endured 3 separate imprisonments, totaling nearly 4 years of her life spent as a prisoner of monarchs who feared her claims and her schemes. She lost her husband to violence in Scotland, her younger son to disease in England, and most of her grandchildren to the high infant mortality of the age. She lived to see her daughter-in-law Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned in England, her grandson James VI ruling Scotland under regents, and her great-granddaughter Arbella Stewart, facing an uncertain future as yet another royal female with claims but limited power to assert them. She died having achieved some of her goals, but having paid a terrible price in suffering and loss. And yet, Margaret's legacy endured. Her grandson James VI of Scotland grew to adulthood and became an effective king, learning from the mistakes of his parents and ruling Scotland with considerably more success than either his mother or father had achieved. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, James peacefully inherited the English throne as James I, uniting the British crowns in one person for the first time, and fulfilling the dream that Margaret had pursued throughout her adult life. The Stuart dynasty that she had worked so hard to establish would rule both England and Scotland for more than a century, producing monarchs both wise and foolish, beloved and reviled, but always carrying the royal blood that Margaret had been so determined to preserve and promote. Arbella Stewart, Margaret's beloved granddaughter, whom she had cared for in her final years, grew up to be beautiful, accomplished, and tragic, raised with the knowledge of her royal blood and her potential claims to the throne. Arbella lived under constant surveillance by Elizabeth I and then by James I, neither of whom wanted her to marry and produce children who might complicate the succession. She eventually made an unauthorized marriage to William Seymour, another person with royal blood, in 1610, and was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where her grandmother had been held 3 times. Unlike Margaret, Arbella did not survive her imprisonment. She died in the Tower in 1615 at age 40, having gone mad from the stress and isolation of confinement. a final victim of the obsession with royal blood and succession that had destroyed so many lives in the Tudor and Stuart eras, the Devonshire manuscript that preserved Margaret's poetry and that of her circle, including the verses exchanged with Lord Thomas Howard, survived and eventually came to the British Library, where it remains today as a witness to the intellectual and emotional lives of Tudor women. Scholars study it to understand Tudor court culture, poetic traditions, and the inner lives of women who are usually known to us only through political records and legal documents. The poems that Margaret and Thomas wrote to each other in the desperate spring of 1536, full of love and defiance and sorrow, still speak to readers nearly 500 years later. Temple Newsam, the great house where Margaret raised her sons and plotted to make Darnley a king, still stands today in Leeds, now a museum and art gallery that welcomes visitors who want to understand Tudor and Stuart domestic life. You can walk through rooms that Margaret knew, see the places where she held Catholic Mass in defiance of Protestant law, and imagine the conversations and plots that unfolded within those walls during the years when Margaret was building her family's future. Westminster Abbey preserves Margaret's tomb, though it has been moved and altered over the centuries. Visitors can still see her effigy, still read the Latin inscription asserting her royal blood and her grandson's kingship, and still marvel at the ambition and determination of a woman who refused to accept the limits that society placed on her. The tomb stands near those of other Tudor figures, near Elizabeth I and Mary I, near Mary Queen of Scots, who was eventually buried there long after her execution, near the monuments to kings and queens and great nobles who shaped British history. Margaret Douglas was not a queen herself, though she came close to inheriting the throne on several occasions. She was not a great religious reformer or intellectual figure. She was not a military leader or a great patron of the arts, though she appreciated learning and supported scholars and artists when she could afford to. What she was a woman of royal blood, who understood that blood was power, who fought throughout her life to position her family to inherit crowns, and who was willing to endure imprisonment, loss, and heartbreak in pursuit of dynastic glory. She lived in an age when women of her class were expected to be decorative and obedient, to marry whom their families chose, to produce heirs, and to otherwise remain silent and subordinate. Margaret refused to be decorative and obedient. She chose her own husband twice, regardless of whether kings approved. She schemed and plotted and corresponded and negotiated to achieve her goals. She practiced her Catholic faith openly when it was illegal and dangerous to do so. She maintained her pride and dignity even when imprisoned, even when her plans collapsed, even when her loved ones died and her dreams turned to ashes. She was not always wise in her choices. Her love affair with Thomas Howard endangered both of them and led to his death. Her determination to marry Darnley to Mary Queen of Scots produced a disaster that destroyed her son and nearly destroyed the Scottish monarchy. Her facilitation of Charles Stuart's marriage to Elizabeth Cavendish led to her final imprisonment and achieved little for her family. She often chose ambition over prudence, pride over practicality, and stubbornness over compromise. These choices brought suffering to herself and to those around her. But she was also capable of great love, great loyalty, and great courage. She loved Thomas Howard enough to risk everything for him, and she remembered him throughout her life even though she never spoke publicly about their relationship after his death. She loved her sons despite their flaws, defended them even when they made terrible mistakes, and mourned them with genuine grief when they died. She loved her grandchildren and worked to give them the best possible chances in life. She remained faithful to her husband Lennox throughout their long marriage, supporting him through exile, political disappointments, and ultimately his violent death. And she remained faithful to the Catholic Church throughout her life. maintaining her beliefs and practices, even when doing so brought persecution and marginalization. As sleep draws near and the story winds to its close, remember Margaret Douglas not as a villain or a hero, but as a complex human being who lived in a dangerous time and who made the best choices she could with the information and options available to her. She was born into royalty, but was never allowed to rule. She had claims to thrones, but was never allowed to press them openly. She was intelligent and ambitious, but lived in a society that offered women few legitimate outlets for those qualities. She was Catholic in an age when England was becoming Protestant, Stuart in an age when the Tudors still held power, and a woman in an age when power was almost exclusively masculine. She endured losses that would have broken many people. The death of her first love, the deaths of most of her children in infancy, the murder of her eldest son, the death of her husband, the death of her younger son, and the knowledge that her granddaughter would probably face similar struggles and disappointments. She was imprisoned 3 times, always released, but always aware that the next imprisonment might be permanent, that the next monarch's displeasure might lead to the scaffold rather than to eventual pardon. She lived to see some of her dreams realized. Her son became a king. Her grandson inherited the Scottish throne. Her family's blood was mingled with that of the Scottish royal house, but she died before seeing the ultimate triumph of her line, the peaceful accession of her grandson James to the English throne that united the British crowns and vindicated all her scheming. She died knowing that she had failed in many ways, that her son's brief kingship had ended in disaster, that her daughter-in-law was imprisoned and discredited, and that the future of her family remained uncertain. Let these final images accompany you into sleep. Margaret, as a young woman at Henry VIII's court, beautiful and accomplished and in love, dancing with Thomas Howard before the catastrophe that would destroy him. Margaret, as a mother at Temple Newsam, and holding her infant son Henry and praying that this child would survive when so many others had died. Margaret watching her son Darnley ride north to Scotland to meet his destiny, proud and hopeful and unaware of the tragedy that awaited. Margaret, as an old woman holding her granddaughter Arbella, telling her stories about Tudor kings and Stuart queens, about royal blood and dynastic claims, about a heritage that was both blessing and curse, and finally, Margaret on her deathbed at Hackney in March 1578, surrounded by those who loved her, receiving the last sacraments of the Catholic Church she had served throughout her life, thinking perhaps of all the people she had lost and all the dreams that had slipped away, but also knowing that her grandson James was King of Scots, that her blood would flow through the veins of future British monarchs, and that she had played her part in the great drama of Tudor and Stuart history. Rest now, dear listener, and let the story of Margaret Douglas fade into the peace of sleep. Her struggles are over, her ambitions achieved or abandoned, her sufferings ended. She lived 62 years in a dangerous age, endured losses that would have crushed lesser spirits, and left a legacy that shaped British history for generations. May her rest be peaceful, may her memory be honoured, and may her story remind us that history is made not just by kings and queens, but by those who loved them, served them, opposed them, and worked in countless ways to shape the world they lived in. Sleep well, and dream of a time 450 years ago, when a princess named Margaret Douglas walked through the great halls of royal palaces, prayed in private chapels, raised her children with love and ambition, and left her mark on history in ways both triumphant and tragic. Her story is told, her life remembered, and now the night beckons us all to rest. Good night.